And of course, I have my document scrolled all the way to the bottom. So hello and welcome to the Nauticast podcast, the one true chapter by chapter podcast going through A Song of Ice and Fire one chapter a week. I'm one of your hosts, Jeff, better known as Brady Fish.
And I'm your other host, Emmett, better known as Poor Quentin.
And welcome to the 79th episode of the Nauticast, titled True Steel, an analysis of A Clash of Kings, JON 1 and 2, in which Jon Snow meets up with good friends, gets challenged by his mentors, and readers are introduced to Azor Ahai Reborn, Dolorous Edd.
And we're very excited to announce our special guest for this episode. You may know him from his terrific YouTube channel, including Killing a Ranger, Part 1 and 2, which is going to be very relevant to the chapters under discussion today. You may know him from his writings over at Watcher on the Wall or his podcast, Maester Monthly. Please welcome Matt, a.k.a. Joe the Magician.
Hi, guys. I'm finally here. I did it. I made it to Nauticast. This is making it.
This is making it for you, man.
Making it. I think the last. Wait, no, I've appeared on this before at that at the Fire and Blood event. We got into an argument about.
That was great.
Got into an argument live on stream about Stannis and Renly. It was great.
No, it was actually about it was about something else, right? It was about the Dance
I was arguing about Stannis. I don't know what you were arguing about.
I don't know if anyone was arguing back successfully.
True,
but you sure were. But yeah, we've been not waiting. We've been just looking forward forever to having you on the regular cast. And we knew especially we had to have you on for Jon, because you've written so well about Jon and his relationship to Maester Aemon and kind of all the different archetypes and ideas George is playing with in that storyline. And so as soon as we got to Jon and Clash, we knew we had to have you.
And just for everyone else, I was just fist pumping during season 8 when Jon remembered Maester Aemon. I was like, yes, it's all true. All of
your
it.
Fave.
Yeah, it worked out. No one expected the Aemon cameo in season 8, but I got it.
That's good. It's good that we actually got that in season 8 for absolutely positively sure. So thank you again, Matt, for coming on. It's going to be a lot of fun doing this episode. As always, this episode is brought to you by our small council, our Hand of the King, Wolfman Zach, Grand Maester Tim Bob, Lord Commander of the Kingsguard, Mark N., Lord Travis, Master of Ships and War of the Waves, Sir Keith J., Master of Whisperers, Lord Philip the Merciful, Master of Laws, Jancy O., Lady Commander of the Night's Watch, Lord Jean, Master of Coin, Archmaester June, Healer of the Lesser Poxes, Ragged Michael, Warden of the North, Nelson the Hammer, Prince of Dragonscone, Scarlet the Other Red Woman and Mistress of Whisperers, Lord Baby the Onion Baby, Lord Blackheart the Defiant, Master of Zorse, Lord Micah, Warden of the West and the Kraken's Bane, Lord James, the Gem that was promised, the High-Bearded Priest, the Blue-Ringed Octoling, Lord Jake, Assistant to the Hand of the King, Lady Xena Valerian, Hedrical, Captain of the Airship Arrogance. Hello, Livy. Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Our favorite co-host.
What's up?
The secret co-host.
Very secret.
I gotta. We can't sit on my lap right now. I gotta do this podcast. Love you.
Funny thing is, he says that to Emmett every episode.
And yet I persist. I always end up in his lap by the end.
That's true. True that. His Grace's High Inquisitor Frank B., Lord James Stormboard, War of the Worldwide Werewood, Sir Jasper the Cruel, the King's Justice, Lawrence, Prince of Dorne, Richard, Seedler of Bravos, Kelly, War of the East of the Mistress. Sorry, something's going wrong with my mouse here. Kelly, War of the East and Mistress of Old Bay of Crabs, and our two newest members of the Small Council. You heard that right. Two newest members of the Small Council. Stephen the Steadfast, Master of Hounds, and the Blue Winter Rose, Knight of Highgarden. Thank you, counselors, very much.
Thank you to all our counselors, especially our two new ones. We keep having to buy a bigger and bigger council table. It's just going to run us entirely out of money.
It really, really will. So yeah, and thank you guys so much. I mean, yeah. Someone said today on the Slack that we're gonna have, by the time we're done this, we'll have enough counselors to we'll have more words, more small counselors, and then there will be words that wins the winner. And I absolutely hope that is the case for absolutely sure. Our spoiler warning to talk about in all episodes. We'll potentially be talking about all published books. That is the 5 novels, 3 Duncan Egg novellas, histories, interviews, the Windsor sample chapters, as well as Game of Thrones, the TV show. Anything and everything.
Our question this week comes from Lady Pearl of Detroit, a sworn sword. She wrote us a long, fantastic message, but for length purposes, we'll only read the too long didn't read she helpfully included at the end. Considering the speed at which the free folk are gathering and harrying the watch to be able to cross the wall to get away from the others, can anyone give insight into why the others' advance is taking so long, considering both the current 3-year timeline and how George could have made it work if he'd kept the 5-year gap? Yeah, that's a really interesting question that touches on a number of aspects of the series, what the others' ultimate purpose is, how long they've been active, and the more kind of military strategic considerations that you don't always apply to an eldritch evil. But I think that needs to be asked here because they strike at Waymar Royce, they strike at the Fist of the First Men. They may have something to do with Benjen's disappearance, but they're also not going all in on Mance until his people try to attack the wall. So it's definitely a mystery worth discussing. So what do you think about that, Jeff?
Yeah, I think it's interesting, right? So it feels to me that the others are kind of hurting the free folk into like against the wall, so to speak, in a way. I wonder if there's some sort of intelligence again at work. Like we've talked before about the others don't have any culture, according to Elio Garcia Jr., who had talked to George R. Martin about this, but they do have some sort of intelligence. So I do wonder if that's kind of the thing that they're trying to lessen the numbers that they're going to potentially have to face in Westeros. Possibly their memories of the Long Night are also exist. I think, Matt, you've written a lot about that, about how the others seemingly have a memory of what happened in the Long Night in the years before, and that memory is going to have an impact on them and how they're going to deal with that. I do think it's interesting, right, that like what would have happened if there had been a 5-year gap in the story. Like for me, it doesn't make a lot of sense that the others would just be kind of just milling about for 5 years, waiting for the plot to catch up with itself, waiting for the kids to age up, I guess, is that's the reason why George had that plot line at the first place. But I do think it's weird. I still think that the 5-year gap is something that George was right to abandon, although opinions differ, of course. But I also think it could be potentially kind of messing up a little bit in terms of writing the Winds of Winter. Who knows ultimately? But I do think that one of the ways why this did work out, that the abandoning the 5-year gap worked out, is that it does put a more immediacy on the plot and forces the plot forward. So we're kind of like, yeah, we need to get moving on the plot. So it always has to be moving forward. It can't be this thing where the others just kind of waiting around for the plot to catch up. So I'm happy that the 5-year gap isn't there, but I think we'll see what happens when we get the Winds of Winter next week, the week after, something like that.
Yeah, I mean, the others are kind of waiting around now. Even without the 5-year gap, you still do have to answer the question of why they're not currently attacking the wall. That is kind of an open question from the first chapter in the series forward. Is it possible that they're waiting for a proper opponent? Like, I mean, one of the great ironies of Stannis showing up at the wall, like sword blazing and ready to save the day, is that the others look at him and go, no. we weren't waiting for you. Who are you? What are you doing here? So is it possible that they sense that there needs to be someone like Jon Snow, or that they're waiting because they have these memories of the Long Night, they're waiting for another figure like that to confront before they come to the wall? Or is it something to do with Bran? What do you think, Matt?
I think, the biggest reason, and it's pretty big, is just the wall's still there. Like, they seemingly cannot go past it, and they've been cooling their heels between 5,000 to 10,000 years behind it. If they could knock it down before, you think they would. So they may be waiting for someone to essentially break their cage, which is kind of what the wall is in a way. And they've been chilling for at least active. Like, we don't know when they went from being mists to being beings again. That who knows when that was, but it's definitely in Craster's lifetime. So they've been waiting several decades at the very least. I don't think what another 5 years would mean to them, especially when they're so long lived and they're basically immortal. I just think they're waiting for the wall to come down, and they just don't really know how to do it. Or, I mean, the show has it with they steal a dragon, they use that to knock down the wall. It may be something along those lines where it's a magical thing they don't have.
There's something a weapon they need, or something analogous to the Horn of Jormungand, if not the Horn of Jormungand itself. I think the most telling incident for me in this regard is that they do go all in on attacking Tormund's people once the attack on the wall fails, which suggests, as many people have mentioned before, that they left Mance alone for the most part because they thought he'd be useful in getting rid of the Night's Watch, or maybe destroying the wall himself, and that they wouldn't have to do it. And once his attack failed, then the Wildlings can kind of outlive their usefulness. So they descended on Tormund's band. But yeah, they do seem to need something. And one thing I'm interested in, especially in regards to my boy Euron, is whether they're actively trying to influence anything south of the wall. Do they have any agents south of the wall? Can they enter anyone's mind south of the wall? Obviously they can't physically pass. Can any part of their magic? And that's an open question I'd like to learn more about.
Othor and Jaffer went through and were animated, so something can go through, but it doesn't seem like they can do it themselves. And I think one thing that's interesting about them is that while they're waiting for something, if they're influencing stuff south of the wall, we've seen how prophecy works for everybody else. And they are created ostensibly by the Children of the Forest. where a lot of these powers seem to generate from. So if they can see the future too, it's very likely that they're playing their own Melisandre game or their own or a Maester Aemon game where they're waiting for all the right things to line up and then they're going to go. But they're having trouble seeing it because, as we've seen, especially from Bran's perspective, like, how do you interpret these things and get them right? Nobody does.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Maybe the others are as incomplete in their understandings of prophecy as the humans are. Maybe they've made mistakes, or they know they have blind spots and are waiting on some element to complete the puzzle, so to speak.
And this is a crazy question. I don't know if this has ever been addressed themselves. Yes, right, exactly.
Yay.
Do the others, do they have the ability to breathe, or are they just like completely, I mean, they're sort of like ice demons, right? And the reason I ask that is because if the horn theory is true and we have, you know, the fact that Jormungand's horn could bring down the wall, right? Which is mentioned over and over again from A Clash of Kings on to Jon's penultimate chapter in A Dance with Dragons. Do they need like basically a human thrall or some sort of human working for them? Kind of like your Sour Billy Tipton, right? Character who has to like do all the work for the others that they have to, that they can't do themselves, such as like potentially breathe, right? So they need someone to, you know, blow the horn of Jormungand and bring the wall down. And maybe they even thought that the massive horn that Mance produces in the Storm of Swords in Jon's 10th chapter, maybe that was they thought that was the actual horn itself. I don't know. But they also were attacking the Fist of the First Men, which was where the other horn was, you know, the actual true horn. So I don't know. I have many questions for you, gentlemen.
Sadly, for you.
Sadly, we lack answers. I think, you know, Bran's visions will hopefully, I think, be a component to this in the Winds of Winter, even as much as everything going on with Jon. I think, in many ways, kind of Bran and Jon are two halves of the whole in terms of getting information about this aspect of the story. And Jon might be more involved in getting information on what's going on now, and Bran might be more involved in getting information on what's going on in the past. And neither one will have the complete picture, but the reader will by putting the two of them together. That might be generally what we're heading towards.
Absolutely. So thank you, Lady Pearl of Detroit, for the question. Excellent question. And welcome again. I think you are a relatively new patron. I know you did ask this question, I think, about 2 months ago, but thank you for the questions. Excellent. Thank you so much. And now we're going to take a few moments here to chat with our people here on the YouTube and do a little bit of chatting here as my dog starts growling underneath of me, because of course he does. You know, I have children and dogs who are running in and out of the my recording studio tonight, which is a lot of fun. And see if you guys have any questions for us or just things you want to discuss about the episode or anything at all.
Yes, indeed. Send us appropriately your least appropriate questions that we can make Jeff blush, as always.
He's so cute when he blushes.
For sure. Broken King has a great question. Given the character similarities, do you believe that Ned Stark is the man Stannis could become if he had a more loving relationship with his brother? And yeah, I've mentioned before, I think you can see Stannis in part as like, you know, Ned dies at the end of a Game of Thrones, and then like Stannis is the version that like the grave spits back out. Like this much more cynical, hardened, alienated version of Ned. So I think, yeah, I mean, part of what tethers Ned to both hope and despair is his family. Like the death of Lyanna and his father and his brother hurt him so much, but his love for his kids and his love for Jon and his love for Lyanna via his love for Jon is also what tethers him and makes him a great person. So yeah, I think that's a fair framing. Do you guys agree?
Yeah. I amen, brother. Right. I mean, I think, I think like, you know, we like obviously Stannis here on the Nightcast podcast, but he's a poor man's Ned Stark, right? I mean, he's what's left over after, you know, we have, you know, a death in the family. Like you have to go to, you know, you're kind of tired, ugly uncle. Like afterwards, when dad dies, right? You got to stay with him for a little while. But he's not necessarily a good person, but he does retain some of your father's characteristics. Am I speaking from personal experience? No, I don't think so.
It's not very personal,
right?
Easy, Jeff. My thing about Stannis and Ned is that the important part about them is not that they're particularly dissimilar. It's which one Robert liked better. And it's interesting to think that all these years later, it's just coming back to the idea of like the brother you chose, which is something that I think you guys condemn Robert for a bit, like, why couldn't you be nicer to his brother? But then it's something that Jon does where he chooses the brothers that he wants versus his real family. And we're like, oh my God, that's so awesome. And it's interesting how that George plays with that over and over and over again, choosing family versus the one you're born with.
Yeah, that's an excellent point, and that's something that Stannis brings to the forefront for Jon when he gives him this temptation: go back to Winterfell with me, or stay here in the Night's Watch. It's he's making him choose which family, and then that's definitely fraught because of Stannis' relationship with his own family and his own perspective on Robb. So yes, I think that's great. Ragged Michael asks, when Jon returns to Winterfell, will he learn from Robb's errors? And that's an interesting question. I'm more pro Robb Stark than average, I think, in terms of his overall record. I think he made fewer mistakes than his general reputation suggests. I do think the one, marrying Jane and refusing to sire a bastard on her, that does strike me as something Jon would think he wants to do. But how it turned out with Ygritte is very different. But then Ygritte socially, politically, is just a very different figure than Jane Westerling. So what do you guys think about that? Do you think Jon is going to specifically look back at mistakes Robb made and try to improve on them? And what do you think those might be?
Well, how many people are actually alive that are going to be able to tell Jon,
I don't think he's
here's
aware.
what Robb did wrong?
True. Well, maybe in the reader's eyes then. Like, what mistakes do we know that Robb's made that we are going to see Jon improve on, even if Jon isn't himself aware of it?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think I want to say don't marry for love, but I think maybe the show provides a pathway for Jon and Daenerys kind of hooking up because he's choosing her for love, and that's ultimately going to be one of Dany's betrayals, the one for love, right? Or another one of the betrayals. Who knows which betrayal that's Jon Snow is going to be for Daenerys, but she's definitely going to be one of them for sure. I think some of the other mistakes, like the military ones, Robb didn't make any military mistakes as far as I know, as far as I believe. So I'm more pro Robb Stark, I guess, than the average person. I think politically, I think maybe he wouldn't hold on to the Riverlands as King Jon Stark. I think that's an impossible task, something that George has spoken of specifically, saying that, Robb had a chance to hold on to the North, but the Riverlands would have been an impossible task to hold both them and the North. But then you also have the countervailing thing going on where the Ironborn invade and then end up forcing another front in Robb's rear during the War of the Five Kings, which, right. I don't know. What do you think, Matt? Do you think that Jon will learn from Robb's mistakes?
Well, he definitely hasn't learned from the Jane Westerling mistake. He's already pseudo-married one girl, almost got him killed once, then got actually killed. And Val looks like that's another one that's has a dagger going for his heart. But I think Robb's big mistake that I don't think Jon will repeat is letting people crown him. I don't think Jon's going to let that happen. That was really the downfall of Robb. Once he became a king, there was no going back. He had to suddenly stand up to Renly and Stannis. He had to stand up to Joffrey. Whereas if he had found an ally, as I think Jeff has, and I think Stephen Atwell have talked about, any of those forces joined together probably wins the war. But because Robb had to be opposed to them because he's now a king, it kind of goes sideways. Jon in no way is probably going to let himself become a king. And as we saw in the show, he very much refused that, and I think that's part of him that's true to his book character, where he thinks about it, he thinks he wants it, but when it comes time to actually throw his stone in the lot or whatever, or his dice in the lot, he doesn't actually do it. The closest he comes is letting himself become Lord Commander, but even that, he's not really acting like a Lord Commander in the way that Robb is acting like a king, which actually comes up during this chapter where Elsie, as you guys call him, describes how Robb's living like a king, and Jon never will. He kind of keeps that going even when he's Lord Commander. He never lives like the king on the wall that he is.
Very true.
The interesting thing about it, though, is even the way that Elsie Mormont, and we'll talk about this in the main chapter itself, describes the way that Robb is going to live. Robb, as far as we could tell, is not actually living that way, dressed up in all velvets, drinking summer wine. He spends the entire of his fucking reign at war, right? That's his entire trajectory. His royal trajectory is just in war, in the field, on the battlefield, or threatening, as we're going to find out in Catelyn 1 in 2 weeks, or in a week, I guess, for us, because we get to record in a week. That he's got the one Frey guy. Eamon Frey, is it Eamon Frey is the guy who's out there? Not Eamon Frey. What's the guy's name? The Frey.
Which Frey?
The treats with the Starks at River Run.
Lothar?
Oh, Lothar. And Black Walder, right?
No. I'm talking about the guy who was taken prisoner fighting for the Lannisters. Cleos. There you go.
Right. Yeah.
It's easy not to remember him.
Nobody remembers Cleos. Not even Jaime and Brienne.
Right. Exactly.
He's quite forgettable.
He is. But yeah, I mean, Robb is not going to have an easy time at being king. He's going to be in the field for the entirety of his reign. It's interesting, though, that Mormont tries to set this really stark contrast between what Jon is going to experience and what Robb is going to experience, but it's actually not true. Is everyone saying Cleos there in the goddamn
they're
chat?
saying Cleos. You're all so smart. You got it.
You got me.
Matt mentioned Val, which leads nicely into another question we got from Kyle Hahn. What is Val's role going forward? Very interesting question. Val, of course, does not appear in Game of Thrones, but she really comes to the forefront in A Dance with Dragons, connected to Jon and his relationship to being Lord Commander and relationship to the wildlings in a way that seems to set her up as important, even though a lot of the plot mechanics to come in the North don't necessarily demand her presence, which makes me think that Val's role is endgame, like literally end of the book when Jon goes north of the wall. If he does do that, as in the end of season 8, Val's there, and maybe he ends up with her. What do you guys think?
That would be my dream come true. Jon and Val are made for each other. Jon, Val, Jon. It's the best
Jon,
ship.
Val, Jon.
Jon, Val, Jon.
Jon, Val, Jon.
I want to see it in the chat. All
Hashtag.
the Jon, Val, Jons.
The least toxic of the Jon ships, which is not saying much, but it's there.
Yeah, I think what Val symbolizes is I think she kind of is symbolizing for Daenerys in a weird way, because she is absurdly beautiful, but she has a lot of the same coloring as Dany. She has a lot of the same like outward personality traits. She doesn't take shit from anybody. She's a very tough person, but she's a northern version of Dany. It's almost like walking Jon up to the point where he would like her. Where it's like, well, if you like Val, you will probably like Dany too. But I think she also serves an important point as being like a kind of like a temptation for Jon versus Melisandre, because she's trying to jump his bones throughout A Dance with Dragons and he's resisting. And it's he's being torn between ice and fire, which is the name of the series, but it's like personified with these two people, especially with how much Jon links Val with Ghost and therefore his northern heritage and the Stark heritage. So it's interesting which one he favors when he comes back. Will probably tell us a lot about his endgame in A Dream of Spring.
I think something I love about Jon Valjean, of course, is that Jon spends so much of A Dance with Dragons trying to protect innocent children, right? And ultimately, I think he's going to fail because he's dead. But he's trying to protect Monster, and he's trying to protect Gilly's baby, and he's trying to protect Aemon Steelsong, as he says, right? Is that the same goddamn child? A Monster and Aemon Steelsong.
Monster mixed up. Aemon Steelsong is Mance's baby.
Right. But the interesting thing about that is when Val returns back from being north of the wall, it's interesting that she ends up being the one who ends up safeguarding the one child who's still back in Castle Black, who is actually Gilly's son. There we go. Got to correct that time. And that's fascinating to me, because that does kind of intersect with where Jon is at. And I do wonder whether that's going to be that kind of desire to protect innocent life and protect children specifically, which is something that George focuses a lot about in A Dance with Dragons, is going to end up connecting them at the end. I really hope that's the case. I mean, that seems like a super sappy ending for Jon, but maybe he deserves it given the amount of shit he's been through, to include dying, being stabbed in the fucking heart. Maybe it's time for Jon to catch a break at the end.
Although Val wants to kill Shireen, so they might.
Everybody's trying to burn her. Everybody's doing it.
All she says is that it would be, kinder to put a knife through her and a pillow or something.
Yeah,
like
that's
that.
all she says.
That's all. That's it.
It's just like when Robert was casually talking about maybe it would be better off if Bran died. No, nothing turned out to come of that. But I think Val at Endgame makes sense, because I was saying I don't really see a big plot push for her like before then, like involved, because you still got Tormund there as a leader of the wildlings. And there's no way that obviously the marry Val to someone to get Winterfell plan that Stannis has is not going to actually happen.
She's going to kill the guy.
Exactly. Up, young Kneeler. Up is what she says to that one asshole, Patrick of House Mallister. Gets torn apart by 1-1. Best death in the whole series. Anywho, another question from our buddy KW Dent. Regarding the Horn of Winter, how long into Wind/Dream do you think it will be when the Horn of Winter is used to wake an ice dragon from the wall? Regardless of whether or not that's exactly what happens. I feel like the Horn of Winter is a climactic event. Maybe not exactly at the end, because maybe you need like the others showing up slightly before then, so people get ready, or Stannis burns Shireen in the face of that or whatever. But I always felt like Euron hits Old Town like 2/3-ish, 3/4 of the way through, does his shenanigans, and then the wall comes down from there. That's kind of my mindset on it. What about you guys?
Kind of similar. I think like middle to mid-late portion of the books. I mean, I think I have to imagine. So here's the thing, right? So we're talking about the Winds/Winter structure, which is something that I'm totally not at all interested in whatsoever.
Not in the least.
Not in the least. We have to the first thing we have to do is we have to actually get through the chapters and the stories that were intended for the end of A Dance with Dragons, which is Battle of Ice, Battle of Marine, Arianne and Aegon, and the Battle of Storm's End, which actually was not going to be on page originally, but then George decided to put it on page for the Winds/Winter after he published A Dance with Dragons. Then we have to talk about things like Euron versus the Red Wine Fleet, which has been something that has been building and building and building. And seemingly, in my opinion, George wanted to have that be one of the endpoints for Dance of Dragons. Which would have been really fascinating to have all these things that George apparently wanted to fit into this one teeny tiny little book, which is actually fucking massive. So we have to accomplish all the Dance of Dragons endpoints. Then we have to get into the Winds of Winter proper, or at least the material that was originally intended for the Winds of Winter. And that's, God knows what that's going to be. But I definitely think the destruction of Old Town was going to be one of those events. Like, I do think, like, originally, I think we would have had 2 Aaron Damphair chapters, like the first one, The Forsaken, and the second Damphair chapter, where we have the Battle of the Red Wine Fleet and the potential, massive blood sacrifice out on the Summer Sea. I think it's what we'd be looking at here, whatever the sea is called. I think it's the Summer Sea, right? It's to the south. And then that would have been like the end point. There would have been like a massive, like, huge event where like the blood is sacrificed, and you have potentially the raising of the Krakens. And that is like a great, like, kind of like cliffhanger for Dance of Dragons to like go into the Winds of Winter and things that are going to be occurring in Old Town for the book itself. Now we're here in a interesting place, right? I think, like, now maybe originally, like, the destruction of Old Town would have been like early middle portion of the Winds of Winter. Now it could be mid late portion of the Winds of Winter, just because of the amount of material that George has to process first. I think that's probably what we're looking at. And then the Horn of Winter gets blown like towards the end of the book, I have to imagine, because I imagine the seminal event for the Winds of Winter is the oncoming of winter into Westeros proper itself, otherwise known as the ending to season 7 of Game of Thrones.
Matt, as the Euron skeptic, tell us why we're wrong.
I think the Horn of Winter is not going to do anything. I don't think it's. I think it's I think it's kind of like Azor Ahai or Lightbringer thing, where it's a story that's been told 1,000 times, and so people think there's a literal horn, and if you blow it, then like something crazy will happen. But it's been so long since whenever that happened, like some ancient wildling king, maybe he used it, maybe he didn't, and it's like, anything could be the Horn of Winter. It's like Indiana Jones when you're looking through the Holy Grails and you're like, which one's the real one? Well, maybe one, but probably none of them, because it probably didn't exist, that kind of thing. I tend to think that...
Doesn't he turn out to find the Holy Grail at the end of that, though? And it just
yeah.
to be the humble one that no one would assume would be like a certain horn. Bringing to Old Town. No, you make an excellent point. It could vary... there's a lot of red herring signs all over that stuff, or maybe like we're investing in it too much and we're going to have the rug pulled out from under us. I feel like Dragonbinder, maybe even more than the Horn of Winter, might end up being that way. So that's a totally fair point.
And I think if there was just like a horn laying around, and if somebody blew it in the right way, it brings down the wall. Okay. This thing's been out there for like 10,000 years, probably. Nobody's picked it up. Like we saw John pick up that horn. He's like, oh, I wonder if this works, and just gave it a toot for funsies. Somebody didn't try that. Unless there's a particular song you have to play.
Well, John's
like Zelda. You have to play the song. It's Storms or something.
Right, exactly. I mean, John did blow into it and nothing happened. So that is a sign that maybe it's nothing at all. So that's again, totally fair.
We have a
take, yeah.
We have a question from Bernie. She actually asked this on Twitter 5 hours ago to make sure that actually got on the cast itself. And this will be our final question for this portion, if you guys are cool with that. And then we'll move on to the main cast itself. And then afterwards, as we do every single time, we'll have, half hour to 45 minutes and more Q&A and just bullshitting with you guys. So really appreciate you guys stick around for us for the live cast. It's always a lot of fun to talk with you guys. So Bernie asks at NotAcastASOF on Twitter, specifically at me, Brendan Bfish, because I mentioned it to you before Q&A. Have you noticed that Jon's injured hand is brought up in almost every Jon chapter after it happens? Do you feel this means something, or is it just Gurm's writing technique? I kind of feel like it's just kind of like one of those things, like Jon flexing his hand, like that's just the thing that Jon does. Like, Jon, what do you do? Oh, I'm on it, flexing my hand as always, my burn hand, the one of always the burn hand. I don't, because I'm not very good at this, I don't know if there's any symbolism behind the fact that he's flexing his burned hand, his sword hand specifically. Do you guys think that there's anything behind that, or is that Lightbringer or something like that? Like he's like held on to like the flaming shit or whatever not.
I tend to think it's George had a really cool idea after he burned his hand that at some point his hand's not going to work and he's going to get stabbed from it. He didn't know it was going to be these characters he had made up. He didn't know the plot, but he's like he did with his story about how he came up with the wolves and the brand scene. He probably just saw it and he's like, I'll just make this a thing and I'll get to it eventually.
I'll fit that in. Exactly. And it's just a good like little bit of business, like to show that Jon is conflicted or is anxious about something. He's messing with his hand. And so George doesn't have to write, Jon felt anxious about this. He can just show it to you. I've also said before, not to bring up Stannis yet again, but I think it's a real contrast with how Stannis' hand is always clenched. And Jon is the one who can clench and let go. Clench and let go. Stannis is the one who's always clenched. So like that shows that I think Jon is going to move beyond Stannis and has a more complete kind of political understanding, that Jon is struggling to understand when it's important to hold on and when it's important to let go. I think that's an overall theme. I could easily be reading too much into it, but that's kind of what it feels like to me.
I like that. I like that a lot. But I mean, I do like just the writerly thing of, and when Jon is nervous or he's anxious or something like that. Because I mean, that is one of the last things that we have Jon doing, right? In his final chapter in A Dance with Dragons, as he's going through like all of his family members. He's flexing his hand and thinking about Arya and Sansa and his father and Rob and everyone like that, just before he ends up going forward after he gets the pink letter, of course, and he makes the decision to go south to try and save Arya. So I think it's a really good way. So
I actually can relate to Jon too. When I was a kid, I was trying to get into the front door of my parents' van, and my older brother got there first. So I put my hand on the door, thinking he won't slam the door on my hand. Obviously, he does. Breaks 2 of my fingers. So now I can do this with 2 of my fingers. Just move the top knuckles. And it's a thing I'll do, kind of like Jon does when I'm like nervous or I'm thinking about something, just like unconsciously just move the tops of my fingers. It's the kind of thing somebody with like a long-term like early injury just kind of doesn't let go of.
I do the hair flip when I'm nervous. Just do like kind of hair flip up. Yeah.
I'm never nervous. Anyway.
That's good. Can I live your life?
No.
Absolutely not. All right, I think that'll do us from questions for now, but we'll get to some more around the middle of the episode maybe, and then definitely some at the end if Matt can stick around. So as Jeff said, thank you guys so much in the chat for putting forward your questions, and we always appreciate that. And I think that'll take us back into the body of the episode.
Absolutely. So just a quick reminder, if you guys are a part of our Patreon at patreon.com/NotAcastASOF, we did release our first episode for Fever Dream called Plans to Make, where we're doing a chapter by chapter episode now that we've reached our $5,000 a month goal, which is awesome. Thank you all patrons, regardless of your patrons, very, very much for doing that. If you guys are watching this episode live, it is out for our small counselors and our High Lords, Ladies, and Kingsguard right now. Tomorrow will be out for our Sworn Swords, and on Thursday for our Poor Fellows. If you guys are listening to this episode on the release date, that episode will be out for all patrons $5 and above. So check us out at patreon.com/NotAcastASOF. And we also wanted to do a very quick reminder about our next stretch goal, which is to make 1,000 patrons total, regardless of patronage or anything like that. And at the 1,000 patrons level, we did reference this in our Q&A section for you guys who are listening to this podcast episode. I didn't actually hear that. You have to go back and watch that on YouTube. If we get up to 1,000 patrons, we will have a Not a Cast analysis of The Wind's a Winner, The Forsaken. Imagine my hair blowing back. Yeah,
exactly. My very favorite chapter in all of A Song of Ice and Fire, even though it technically hasn't been published. But it's just a perfect slice of cosmic horror that fits really well into what I was thinking about Euron, and even beyond anyone's perceptions of Euron. It's just a really well written, just creep show of a chapter, like the House of the Undying with a big drop of horror put into the mix. So if we get to 1,000 patrons, we'll be doing a big old episode on that. And like I said, I might even let Jeff talk for part of it. Maybe I'll let him sing.
I sang right there. You didn't even catch me. I slipped.
Oh, we're calling that singing, are we? I thought something had happened off screen that I didn't see, like someone had stabbed your leg and you were screaming in pain. But no, yes, good.
That's good. Good. Excellent. Fantastic.
Wait, does this make Jeff the dusky woman to Emmett's Euron?
No,
even before you were finishing the sentence, I was nodding.
Yes, it does.
Yep,
dusky Jeff.
True.
Oh, guys, I will be anyone's dusky woman if you let me be. All right.
Wait, you'll be Tywin? That's weird.
I didn't just make an sound. I don't know who
Emmett wasn't eating that up like a fine dinner.
All right, guys. So let's get on to the synopsis for Clash of Kings Jon 1 and 2. And I apologize in advance. This is going to be a bit of a long synopsis because these are two. Well, the first chapter is very long and the second chapter is very short. So we have one long synopsis. It is actually 2/3 of our document on Google Documents. So here is the synopsis for Clash of Kings Jon 1 and 2. Jon calls for Samwell Tarly softly through air smelling of paper and dust. Jon looks around, seeing books, scrolls, and the glow of a candle somewhere. Jon blows out his own candle, sensing that maybe having a fire about isn't for the best with all of these old books. He follows the light and finds Samwell Tarly hunched over a table in the middle of the Castle Black library. Jon asks whether Samwell has been in the library all night, and Sam isn't sure. Where Rast and the other Night's Watchmen thought that Samwell had deserted, Jon knew better. Desertion required courage. And Sam had little enough of that. Okay, Jon, I guess we're just going to keep going with this projection from your Game of Thrones chapters. Great. Sam asks if it's morning, and John calls Samuel a damn fool for not keeping to his bed. There ain't going to be any beds where we're going next, man. But Samuel was only here in the library looking for maps, and then he found the books, thousands of them. John thinks that the Winterfell Library only has like 100 books or so, but then quickly changes the subject to asking Samuel if he found the maps. He sure did. The paint had faded, but you can see where the map maker marked the sites of wildling villages. Samuel reached for another book. This, he said reverently, is the account of the journey from the Shadow Tower all the way to Lorne Point on the frozen shore, written by a ranger named Redwyn. It's not dated, but he mentions a Doran Stark as king of the north, so it must be from before the conquest, John. They fought giants. Redwine even traded with the children of the forest. It's all here. John says that maybe Sam could write an account of their ranging, and he means so well, but it isn't taken well. Sam isn't thrilled about the prospect of going north. He wishes he had more time to go through the library to find more maps, but that task would take years to complete. Years to complete? Are you having a meta conversation with us, George, here? But Mormont and readers want the maps and books sooner than months away at best. John picks up one of the crumbling scrolls and reports that it's crumbling. Regular old watcher on the walls over here, John. Sam, nicer than me, says it's crumbling because, yeah, John, it's fucking old. The important books got copied over, with many books having been copied half 100 times. John reads through his crumbling scroll and dismisses it as only about logistics. An inventory, Samuel corrects. Well, who cares how much pickled cod they ate 600 years ago, John wonders. I would. You can learn so much from ledgers like that. Truly, you can. It could tell you how many men were in the Night's Watch then, how they lived, what they ate. John, sophomore philosophy major, says they ate food and lived in houses or some shit, but Sam knows better. The books tell a story. They're treasures. Besides, Sam found books with the faces of trees, a book about the language of the children of the forest, shit that the Citadel didn't even have. Hell, they even have scrolls from old Valyria, accounts of the seasons, thousands of years old. The books will still be here when we return, John said. If we return, Samuel replies. John says they'll be plenty safe. They're taking an assload of rangers, 200, and Corn Halfhand is bringing another 100 with him. Sam will be as safe as if he were back in, Horn Hill. Oh, John, sweet, stupid boy. Why would you even fucking say that? Samuel managed a sad little smile. I was never very safe in my father's castle either. John thinks that the crowds play cruel jests and that Pip and Toad, the guys who desperately wanted to come on the ranging, are going to stay at Castle Black, while Samuel, who really doesn't want to go, is coming on the ranging. Mormont needed Sam to manage the ravens. Sam says that really anyone can take care of the ravens. Hell, even Gren could do it. John too. But John says that his duty is to be the LC's squire and steward. He won't have the time. And besides, Sam, you said the words. You're a brother of the Night's Watch now. A brother of the Night's Watch shouldn't be so scared. We're all scared. We'd be fools if we weren't. And they have good reason to be frightened. Lots of rangers, to include Benjen Stark, had gone missing of late. And the two other guys Benjen Stark had taken with them wound up dead and then undead. John's finger still twitches. He remembers them, and he sees the whites in his dreams with their blue, burning eyes and cold black hands. But Sam didn't need to hear about that right now. There's no shame in fear, my father told me. What matters is how we face it. Come, I'll help you gather up the maps. The vault opens to a tunnel known as the Wormwalks, small passages that you can only move through single file. These wormwalks, so to speak, weren't often used in summer, but in winter, it was the only way to get around when snows piled 40 to 50 feet high. John thinks that time is coming soon, and he ain't wrong. He knew from Aemon that summer's end was at an end, from a bird they got from the Citadel. John had seen winter once before as a boy, but that was short and somewhat mild. This winter would be different. John and Samuel emerge from the depths into a brisk wind and encounter Ghost, a very good boy who is sleeping next to the granary. Sam looks up to the wall high above them, and John feels like the wall is kind of looking like a living thing now, with sometimes different moods as the light hits the wall. And now John feels that right now it's a blue river of frozen rivers. Now John feels that it's a blue river of frozen rivers, then the dirty white of old snow when a cloud passes. The wall stretched east and west as far as the eye could see, so huge that it shrunk the timbered keeps and stone towers of the castle to insignificance. It was the end of the world, and we are going beyond it. And above the wall, you guessed it, the red comet hanging above and able to be seen by day, as Samuel points out. But John's not about comments. He needs to get the maps to the LC quick, fast, and in a hurry. The two men, boys, John's in that kind of middle area, not a boy, not a man. He's a man of the Night's Watch. There we go. Walk through a mostly deserted courtyard of Castle Black. And why is Castle Black deserted? Well, I'll tell you. Because most of the Rangers were out in Molestown digging for buried treasure. At least Gren, Pip, Halder, and Toad were. They did want Sam and John to come, but Sam is scared of scary sex workers, hijinks. And John, well, John be John. John had wanted no part of it. Do what you want, he told Toad. I took a vow. Okay, John, read it. John and Sam pass by a sept, and John hears people singing to a hymn and reflects that some people want to go to Bone Town, other people want to go to church. John's not sure which people felt better afterward. John's not a church boy, though. He kept the old gods, the ones where his church is out in the wild and the weirwood trees. The seven have no power beyond the wall, John thought, but my gods will be waiting. Yes, they will be, John. John spies Sir Andrew Tarth training new boys outside of the armory, and it's a pretty poor crop, to be told. 2 blonde boys, an older man, a ragged clubfoot man, and some idiot who thought he was a warrior. The last one was now getting a lesson on the error of his ways from Sir Andrew, who's a bit gentler than Sir Alistair Thorne, but still brought the bruises. John stops to watch. What do you make of them, Snow? Donald Noy says, standing at the door of the armory, bare-chested and sexy as hell. John thinks that Noy wasn't pretty, which I beg to differ. He's standing there without his shirt on and just his apron with one arm. But anyways, I digress. But Donald Noy had been a good friend to John. So John tells Donald that the boys smell of summer. He asks Donald where the boys come from, and the armorer helpfully replies that they came from a dungeon in Goldtown. A brigand, a barber, a beggar, 2 orphans, and a boy whore. With such do we defend the realms of men. John smiles a secret smile at Sam and thinks they'll do. John and Sam did anyways. So Donald asks whether John has heard about what Rob has been up to of late. John is in the know, but he's unsure about it. Rob? A king? He used to play games and spar with Rob. Hell, John had even shared his first cup of wine with Rob. But they didn't share mother's milk. And now John will drink summer wine while John will drink and now Rob will drink summer wine while John will drink snowmelt. Rob will make a good king, John said loyally. Noy eyes John and asks if he'll actually make a good king, given that the armorer thought the same about Robert and forged Robert's warhammer. He was Robert's man at Storm's End until he lost his arm. He knew Robert and his brothers and his father both. I tell you this, Robert was never the same after he put on that crown. Some men are like swords, made for fighting. Hang them up, and they go to rust. So John asked after Robert's brothers. The armorer considered that for a moment. Robert was the true steel. Stannis is pure iron, black and hard and strong, yes, but brittle, the way iron gets. He'll break before he bends. And Renly, that one, he's copper, bright and shiny, pretty to look at, but not worth all that much at the end of the day, because he's a terrorist. I guess Donald didn't get around to reading my essay, which, so sad, so sad. John wonders what metal Rob is, but he doesn't ask. Given Noy's background, the armorer probably thought that Joffrey was the lawful king and Rob a traitor. Regardless, the men of the Night's Watch really didn't talk about politics up here at the Wall. They took no part, leaving aside their past loyalties. The Night's Watch takes no sides. Yeah, okay, John, sure. John says he's off to see Mormont, and Noy tells him to get going, and he asks for the old gods to be with John on his journey. And John's to bring back Uncle Benjen, okay? John says, of course I will, because he hasn't read the rest of the books yet, and then John and Sam are off to climb the stairs of the King's Tower to make his way to Mormont. They make their way to Mormont to drop off the books and maps, and Mormont grumbles that they took a long-ass time making their way to him. He orders them to put the books and maps down for his inspection, and then Thorin Smallwood steps out to give John and Sam a cool look. Smallwood had once been Alistair Thorne's henchman, and he didn't like these rascally boys. Thorin turns to Mormont and tells him that he should stay tight at Castle Black, but Mormont ain't about that. If you were ever LC, you may do as you please, but it seems to me that I have not died yet, nor have the brothers put you in my place. Smallwood argues and says that he's First Ranger and he should be in command, but again, Mormont ain't about that. He's going himself north of the Wall. He won't be sending men to look for Smallwood when he disappears. P.S. Thorin, Benjen Stark is still the First Ranger until his fate is known for certain. Now stop wasting my time. We ride at first light, or have you forgotten? Thorin Smallwood gets to his feet all saucy and gives a begrudging, yes, sir, and steps out of the room. Smallwood gone, the Elsie huffs and puffs about Smallwood, accosting him for being too old to lead the ranging. He asks the boys whether he looks old or frail, and Sam starts doing that squeaking thing. But John puts in that Mormont looks strong as don't cozen me, Snow. You know I won't have it. Let me have a look at these maps. So Mormont starts going through the maps, complaining about how the maps are all old and these are all that they could find. Really, guys? Samuel stammers out an apology about how everything is disordered inside the library, but Mormont and Blevin, or his Mormont's Raven, are upset about how old the maps are. But John puts in that, sure, the villages will move, but the terrain will be the same. Mormont grunts, as he often does, and asks Samuel whether he chose those ravens yet. Well, Sam hasn't. Aemon is going to help them pick him in the evening. Mormont instructs Sam that he wants strong birds, the best birds. If they're all butchered out there in the woods, yikes, he wants the world to know how they died. Sam goes all speechless at this idea of being butchered, which, yeah, you kind of understand where Sam was coming from. And Mormont tells Samuel a lovely story about how his lady mother told him that if he stood around with his mouth open, that a weasel would mistake it for a lair and run down his throat. If you have something to say it. Otherwise, beware of weasels. He dismisses Samuel to Aemon. Now alone with John, he asks Samuel if he's a fool, and yeah, he had originally intended to send Samuel to Renly's camp, but he figures that Renly wouldn't put up with Samuel's shivering shenanigans. John asks after Renly and what Mormont wants with him, and Mormont tells him that he wants his usual: men, horses, swords, armor, grain, cheese, wine, wood, and wool, and nails. They'll take what they can get. Maybe Sir Alistair Thorne has reached King's Landing by now, and maybe Joffrey will give the Watch something, but the Lancers ain't friends of the Watch. John says they have the White Hand. Maybe that'll help. No, sorry, John, it won't. Mormont wishes he had another hand for Renly, and John helpfully puts in that Tywin believes they can find anything beyond the wall. Yes, you can, John. You really should not be wishing for this. Tywin and John... Mormont snorts and says that Tywin claims the last time they went north, they found a 15-foot tall bear. Absurd, right? But maybe it's the case. There's dead men walking, but Mormont's never seen a giant bear. Yet. Given all the talk of hands, Mormont asks if after John's. It's doing better. Itches though. Mormont asks if John could build Longclaw, and he can, but with pain. But he's working through it with Aemon's help. Blind he may be, but Aemon knows what he's about. I pray the gods let us keep him around for another 20 years. Do you know that he might have been king? Well, no. John's kind of surprised at this. Sure, he knew that Aemon's dad was king, but he figured Aemon for a younger son. Well, in that, John's correct. Aemon's granddad was Daeron II Targaryen, and his dad was Proto-Stannis Maekar Targaryen. Aemon was named for Aemon the Dragon Knight, who may or may not have been Daeron's true father. Regardless, Aemon took to books, not swordplay, and was sent off to the Citadel when he was 9 or 10 years old. He was also 9th or 10th in the line of succession, and then tragedy struck in House Targaryen. Aemon was at his books when the eldest of his uncles, the heir apparent, was slain in a tourney mishap. Interesting. He left 2 sons, but they followed him to the grave not long after, during the Grey sickness. King Daeron was also taken, so the crown passed to Daeron's second son, Aerys. John wonders, is this Mad King Aerys? But no, this was Aerys the First. Aemon was at the Citadel at the time, having forged 6 links on a maester's chain. He served at some lord's court, and then Aerys wed his sister, and all was well, except that Aerys died, and the crown passed to Maekar. Big Daddy Maekar had all his sons come to court wanting their counsel, but Aemon refused. He didn't want to usurp his older brothers. So he served Daeron the Drunkard, Maekar's oldest son, until, tragically, Daeron the Drunkard died. Next up on the docket was Hedge Knight villain Aerion Brightflame, who drank wildfire and died, thankfully. But then Maekar himself also died against an outlaw lord. Very sad. John knows most of this, given that he had Maester Luwin teaching him history back at Winterfell, so he tells Mormont that a great council was called, how Aerion's son was passed over as well as Daeron's daughter, and the crown fell to Aegon Big Egg Targaryen. Mormont offers some correction to this. Yes and no. First, they offered it quietly to Aemon, and quietly he refused. The gods meant for him to serve, not to rule, he told them. He had sworn a vow and would not break it, though the High Septon himself offered to absolve him. In the end, they turned to Big Egg, Aemon's younger brother, and Aemon, knowing that his presence would be bad for Egg, decided to seek for the wall and has remained there since that time. And all this as House Targaryen fell into ruin and then desolation. Bloodraven, Mormont's Raven, starts saying king, 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 and John comments that the bird likes the word. Mormont says it's an easy word to say, and John jokes around that, well, maybe the bird means for Mormont to have a crown. The realm has 3 kings already, and that's too many for my liking, Mormont said, stroking the raven under the beak with his finger, but all the while, his eyes never left Jon Snow. John feels all weird inside, so he asks Mormont why he's telling him all this stuff about Aemon. Oh, no reason, John. Just that, like your bro is like king of the north, you're kind of like Aemon in that way, with a king for a brother. John says he has a vow too, but Mormont snorts at him and talks about all the men who have broken vows on the wall. When John puts in that he always knew that Robb would be the Lord of Winterfell, our good LC gives another snort and says, a lord's one thing, a king's another. They're going to do all sorts of great things for Robb. He gets to wear nice clothes, wed a beautiful princess, and get sons on her. And you, John, you're going to be all in black with neither wife nor children. They're going to call Robb your grace and sing his praises. Does that bother you, John? Does it? Does it? Tell me that none of this troubles you, John, and I'll name you a liar, and I know I have the truth of it. John sits up straight like his mother told him to. Oh, wait, not his mom. Never mind. That's kind of a little bit of a sensitive topic right there. And if it did trouble me, what might I do, bastard that I am? What will you do, Mormont asked, bastard as you are? Be troubled, said John, and keep my vows. Sometime later, John and the Night's Watch are north of the wall, passing by a village known as White Tree. John reflects that it's not much of a village, given that there's all of 4 one-room houses about, roofed with sod and shuttered windows made of ragged hides. But above the houses looms the pale limbs and dark red leaves of a massive weirwood. John thinks it's the largest tree he's ever seen, given that it's 8 feet wide with its branches shadowing the entire village. But John isn't bothered so much by the tree's size as, well, the haunted fucking face carved into the tree with a large fucking mouth large enough to swallow a sheep. But of course, there are not sheep bones in the mouth itself. Nor is that the sheep skull in the ashes. Mormont rides up, frowning about how the tree is old, but he's not that old, guys. He wants everyone to know this, especially you. Thorn Smallwood, get your ass over here. John says the tree is powerful and that Smallwood is there to helpfully offer to cut the tree down. But John says that no lies can be said in front of the heart tree. Ned had told him as much, and Mormont's dad had said similarly. Mormont wants to take a look at the skull, though, and they dismount to give it a look-see. John dismounts, thinking about having Longclaw on his back and how the men had joked around and said it was a, quote, bastard sword for a bastard. He reaches into the maw of the weirwood tree and pulls out another skull. Great, so many skulls. He brings the skull to Mormont, and we get some good wildling lore. The wildlings burn their dead. We've always known that. Now, I wish I'd asked them why, when there were still a few around to ask. John remembers Arthur, and it's like, Mormont, it's really not a fucking mystery why the wildlings are burning their dead. God damn it. But the LC continues saying how he wishes he knew what happened or who burned them, and especially where the wildlings have gone. The children of the forest allegedly could speak to the dead, but Mormont can't. He throws the skull back to the tree and orders his men to go through the houses. He wants another ranger, Giant, who's Giant is this particular ranger's name, to climb the tree to have a look about and bring the hounds. The rangers go through the houses in pairs, and John gets paired with none other than Quaith. Not Quaith. Quaith is not in this chapter. We're not going to get to her for a little while then. John was paired with Dour Edison Tullett, a squire, gray of hair and thin as a pike, whom the other brothers called Dolorous Ed. Bad enough when the dead come walking, he said to John as they crossed the village. Now the old bear wants them to be talking as well. No good will come of that, I warrant. And who's to say the bones won't lie? Why should the dead make a man more truthful or even clever? The dead are likely dull fellows, full of tedious complaints. The ground's too cold. My gravestone should be larger. Why does he get more worms than I do? I could just spend the rest of the synopsis just reading Dolorous Ed quotes, but I can't. I know I can. John looks through a door and sees packed earth and no furniture about. The only sign that anyone lived in the huts is a pile of ashes beneath a smoke hole and a pile of straw, which apparently served as bed. What a dismal place to live, John said. Well, I was born in a house much like this, declared Dolorous Ed. Those were my enchanted years. Later, I fell on hard times. John and Ed poke around for a bit, but then Ed smells old dung and a pile of straw that may have been a bed at one time. They search through the straw, but don't find anything. And that's par for the course. All of the huts turn out the same, with the people, possessions, and livestock gone, and the village itself hadn't been attacked. This was the same thing they had seen both in White Tree and the previous 3 villages they had searched. John wonders what happened, and Ed says that something bad happened, something unimaginable, except that Ed can imagine it, because he can imagine the worst case scenario for anything. The hounds that Mormont summons start sniffing around, with Storm of Swords prologue POV Chet cursing them for, I guess, smelling around or something. When John catches Chet's sight, though, Chet's eyes narrows. He doesn't like John. Wonder if that's going to have any payoffs in Storm of Swords. Yes, it will. Regardless, there's not much going on in this village. Pure nothingness. Gone, cried Mormont's raven, flapping up the weirwood to perch above them. Gone, gone, gone. Thorin Smallwood puts in that there were wildlings in this village a mere year ago, but Jarman Buckwell, commander of the Scouts, says that, yeah, lots of shit changes in a year. Like Robert Baratheon. He was king a year ago. But Sir Mallador Locke has it that it's all for the good that the wildlings are gone. Fewer enemies. You fucking idiot. Stop talking. John hears a sound from above, and Giant, who in reality is barely 5 feet tall, descends from a tree and reports that there's a lake to their north with small hills to the west. Smallwood requests to camp at White Tree, but Mormont says they're heading to the lake to camp, and he needs to write to Maester Aemon. So John retrieves quill, parchment, and ink and brings them to Elsie, who writes a chapter summary for Clash of Kings John 2. At White Tree, the 4th village. All empty, the wildlings gone. Elsie Mormont summons Sammo Tarly to get one of the birds to deliver a message, and Jon mounts his Garen to find Sammo. He passes by Night's Watchman enjoying some salted beef, pissing, scratching, and talking. The command passes for them to settle up, and they get quiet and get to their task with Buckwell's scouts ahead, Smallwood in command of the vanguard, the Elsie with the main force, Malador Locke with the baggage train, and pack horses, and Sir Auden Withers with the rear guard. 200 Night's Watch bros, half mounted in total. They had started their movement from Castle Black, passing through game trails known as the Ranger Roads that pushed into the Horned Forest, camped beneath the starry sky, and looked up at the red comet still up there, still beguiling our POVs as to its meaning. And while the party had first started out in good spirits, joshing with each other as the bros are wont to do, the mood had gotten tense and silent the farther they had moved into the woods. The farther they had moved north, the woods, the abandoned villages, everything is making these bros scared. Jon takes his gloves off and lets his burned fingers feel the cold air. He thinks about how he used to run those fingers through Arya's hair, and he hopes she's doing well. And oh boy, Jon, bad news on that front coming up in our next Arya chapter. He flexes his fingers, knowing that he needs them to be nimble and strong to grasp a sword beyond the wall. He finds Sammo Tarly, though, watering horses with the other stewards, with a cage of ravens on one of the wagons behind one of the pack horses he maintains. As Jon approaches, he hears the ravens saying what sounds like words. He asks whether Sammo has been teaching the ravens words, and Sammo admits that, yeah, he has. 3 of them even know how to say snout, snout, snout. One bird croaking my name was bad enough, said Jon, and snow is nothing but a black brother wants to hear about. Snow often meant death in the north. Sam asks what they found at White Tree, and Jon recounts that they found nothingness and bones. Sammo takes a bird from the cage, attaches the Elsie's message, and sends it flying with the command to fly home now, brave one. Home, home, you're free. Home. No, he doesn't actually say that. Sam wishes he could fly home too, and Jon wonders if Sam is still afraid. Well, he is, of course, but not as scary as he was before. The first night, he thought that someone pissing was the wildlings coming to slit his throat. But hey, the dawn rose and Sammo was able to get vertical. And though Sam is craven and he's sore all over, he kind of likes it out here. He's barely scared all the times these days. Plus, Sammo's even been working on his maps. Yay, fucking maps. The world is strange, Jon thought. 200 brave men had left the wall, and the only ones who were not growing more fearful was Sam, the self-confessed coward. We'll make a ranger of you yet, Jon joked. Next thing, you'll want to be an outrider like Gren. Shall I speak to the old bear? Sam says, please do not do this thing, and pulls up his hood on his cloak. Sammo was hoping to spend the night in the village and sleep under a roof, but Jon says there ain't enough roofs for all the men. Jon mounts up and rides back up the column, having seen enough of White Tree. Just then, Ghost emerges from the trees and nearly scares Jon's horse half to death. Most of the time, Ghost was off hunting away from the main line of advance, but these days, Ghost had not been having much success at hunting. The woods were as empty as the villages. Diamond had told them the night around the fire. We're a large party, Jon had said. The game's probably been frightened away by all the noise we make on the march. Frightened away by something, no doubt, Diamond said. Jon settles his horse from ghostly terror and rides up to Mormont with his direwolf at his side. The Elsie asks if the raven has been dispatched, and Jon says, yep, mission accomplished. Oh, also, Sammo's teaching the birds how to talk. Mormont snorts, and God, he is always snorting in these chapters, getting a little annoying, and says that Sammo will probably end up regretting doing that. They ride in silence for a while until Jon asks what Benjen would have done if he found all these villages empty. He would have made it his purpose to learn why, and it may be someone or something did not want that known. Mormont says there'll be 300 when Corrin Halfhand arrives, so if they meet with any enemy, they'll beat the dog piss out of them. They're going to find their enemy, or they will find us, thought Jon. And that is A Clash of Kings, Jon 1 and 2. Sorry, super long synopsis. I know, again, it's like 2/3 of our document here in Google Docs. But these chapters, I like them. They're good chapters, I think. On the whole, I think I prefer Jon 1 over Jon 2. I think Jon 1 does a great job of kind of reacquainting us with Jon's thematic impulses and kind of decisions from the first book. Gives us some more backstory about Aemon Targaryen, which I know that Matt is very excited to talk about here in a little bit, and gets us reinvested in the struggles of the men of the wall. While Jon 2 is kind of a short chapter that's almost entirely tone setting, right? For the supernatural horror that awaits these poor bastards north of the wall. Poor bastards north of the wall. Get it? Okay, I'll quit. I'll stop. What'd you guys think?
I was singing the praises of Bran's A Clash of Kings storyline last week, and my feelings on Jon's chapters are more conflicted. I would put him as the second weakest POV in the book, the weakest being Dany. The structure of it feels less well-defined to me than his other storylines in the series. As we talked about last time we checked in with Jon, his arcs in A Game of Thrones, A Storm of Swords, and A Dance with Dragons all culminate in a temptation regarding riding south to rejoin House Stark in some capacity. A Clash of Kings doesn't have that same trajectory, and while it does have a hell of an ending on its own terms, all of Jon's best material in this book is relegated to the back half once Corin Halfhand shows up. We've defended George's travelogues on the whole, but I do think there are some pacing issues early on with Jon in A Clash of Kings. Neither of these chapters make it into the show. They start off Jon in season 2 at Crestor's Keep, and I can't really blame them. That being said, there's still a lot of great stuff here in isolation. George never stops doing important character work for Jon, and what really makes Jon's A Clash of Kings storyline work is that Jon is rapidly becoming a more distinctive and interesting character. What do you think, Matt?
Ooh, I had a lot of thoughts about these chapters, and I would say just like off the start, we talked about this a little bit during the pre-show, these are boring Jon chapters. They are not particularly exciting. He's kind of like an action hero sort of character most of the time. He's sort of like a character you play in a video game, and these ones, not much is happening. It's like he's walking through an inn, just like opening and reading books, and like getting to know how his horse works. It's like the training session for what he's going to go through next. But I did pull out some things that I thought were particularly interesting. One thing that really struck me about this, and this is going to come up a lot as we talk through this, especially because of Aemon, was how much Jon internally is acting like Duncan the Tall through the Hedge Knight and through the rest of Duncan Egg, where there's all these really interesting things happening around him. Lots of information, a lot of people having strategy, and just like this crazy stuff happening. And he's just kind of like head down, focusing on the one thing in front of him, which in this case happens to be the maps. Like Sam's going through all the really cool information he finds, and one of them is like, oh my God, look, I found scrolls from the Freehold of Valyrian. Jon's like, yeah, but where are those maps, bro? I need those maps for Elsie. And then it like keeps going. He's like, wow, this is an account of somebody that went to go see the giants and trade with the children and like their speech and like learn about your old gods. And Jon's like, but like, I need those maps. Like, can we move on with this kind of stuff? And that's kind of what he's like this whole time. And Dunk's a little bit like that too, especially I would say during the Mystery Night. It really comes to the fore where you see characters like Bloodraven and all these plots happening around him, important things, and he's like, you can tell he's like a character of destiny, but he doesn't realize it because he's just a character in the story. And I felt that was really strongly showing up in here. It actually kind of reminded me from the show, the Prince Rhaegar reveal, where she says Prince Rhaegar, and Sam's too frustrated and doesn't know it. That like happens many times, I would say, in these chapters. Important things are happening, and it's blowing by him because his focus is elsewhere. Actually, mostly on the others, which I think is something that is not explicit most of the time, but you can tell the gears are always turning. It's his first priority is make sure he doesn't piss off Mormont, and his second priority is he's always thinking about Othor and Jaffer, and those kind of underlying information. It's kind of like a Tyrion sort of thing that George does later, where Tyrion's always working on something, but it's not always explicitly being told to you. I also thought that the first chapter was very odd. Because like you were saying, the tone and like the pacing, it was an info dump, but that doesn't normally happen to Jon. George usually does it more elegantly. He has characters discover it, like Sam's doing, or he has Tyrion think about it or recall it, or it comes up naturally. It's kind of like Jon walked into a room and just like information started blasting through a speaker at him, and then he walks out and he's like, there, I did it. And it was something I was thinking about as I was reading it, where it kind of feels like this maybe was a very late edition chapter, like something that wasn't there initially, because of the information that's in it. Like if you go back through it, the information that's presented really is, you get a lot of information about the Targaryens and their history, especially their genealogy. You learn about Jon's previous endpoint in a Game of Thrones. Then you pick up a lot on the old gods and the Children of the Forest and the giants and the weirwoods and all these things being real and terrifying. You get a lot about Maester Aemon. And then more, he's thinking about the whites and the others. And it's like someone went to him and said, like, George, nobody knows that Jon's your main character. Like, everyone thinks it was Ned and you just killed him. Like, Jon's kind of like a bit character in a Game of Thrones. Well, not really a bit character, but he's not the obvious hero, I would say, at that point. You could make the mistake of thinking it was maybe Robb or definitely Daenerys, but not Jon Snow. And it's like, this feels very much like an editor's note. Like, I know you don't want to, I know you have him going beyond the wall already, but you really need to go back and push to the audience that this stuff is important. And I think the scene where he walks out of the wormways and the comet's going overhead, and then Ghost walks up, and then there's a white raven from the Citadel saying that summer is over. And then he looks at the wall and sees how it's like a frozen river, and then he sees the snow in it, and he's thinking like, wow, I'm going into like past the end of the world. It's like he needed to remind his audience just like a little bit that Jon's plot is important and that it's like mystical and weird and it's going there, because I don't think anybody knows after a Game of Thrones. It's pretty much just an internal drama for him.
Well, it's interesting, right? And when we actually got to see like how Anne Grohl actually edits books, we got like the part of A Dance with Dragons. You know, we have a picture of Anne Grohl editing Jaime's single chapter in A Dance with Dragons, and she has that note in there being like, you know, George, for you it might be like just yesterday when you were writing this chapter and you're very familiar with Jaime, but the readers have not been with Jaime now for upwards of 6 years since he was in A Feast for Crows. So you need to go back and kind of reintroduce us to the themes of Jaime there. So I think that's a really good meta theory on your part. You should get into the meta theory of writing.
I should write some of those, You
should do that, yeah.
Well, especially this is the book where we get the visions of the Undying, right? With the blue rose and the ice wall. It's important looking back on this chapter in particular where Jon thinks it's nothing, and then to the rest of the world, him standing there is a huge deal because of the prophecy and all that stuff around him. And I also thought one thing was super, super interesting was how much Aemon was mentioned in these two chapters and doesn't appear. And it's kind of like, I think I talked about this on Girls Gone Canon. We talked about his speech to Jon and the love is the death of duty, and how I thought that was kind of like a synopsis for his character, but it's such a short chapter and it happens so quickly, and the rest of the story moves on, because then Ned dies and then everything goes crazy in King's Landing. You can forget it. This feels like another editor's note when they're like, if this is actually your point for Jon, if you need him to think about like his vows and duty and where he's going as a character, you need to go back and re-emphasize this if this chapter is as important as you think it is. And then you see that. It basically reintroduces everything about Aemon. The entire conversation comes back, and he's brought up even in the second chapter where it's like, he's like, Aemon, pay attention to Aemon. Everything he said's really important, but you don't know why, because you don't know he's a Targaryen yet, basically. And then something for Emmett that I thought was really cool was I'm currently in the middle of reading a bunch of Lovecraft stories, and reading this chapter, particularly the first one, and then going beyond the wall, so much, like in particular, what is it? I want to make sure I get the name right. Hang on a second. Unknown Kadath. The Dream Quest of Unknown Kadath with his character Randolph Carter, where he starts off in his normal dream world and he decides, I'm going to go past what I know and see what happens. And he starts meeting everything he knows gets twisted and evil and scary, and he meets things he's never heard of, and everything's terrifying that he thought was comforting. And that's kind of happening to Jon, especially as we get to White Tree Village. And there's also a lot of shades of Lord of the Rings, I would say, right here. There was a lot of Frodo and Sam. Hey, look at that. Jon and Sam, basically the same. Going into Mordor. That's kind of, it was like a frozen Mordor thing. That's kind of what I thought. But also, there's elements, I think, of Faramir's charge ordered by Denethor, where Elsie Mormont's plan is so suicidal that it almost feels Denethor-like, where it's like, what are you doing? And it's hard not to see the comparisons where all the men are like, yeah, we're going to die, and this is stupid. Why are we doing this?
Well put, sir. It does definitely have that, like a slow burn suicide charge. Like it's getting gradually ramped up, and it's not just logistically, but morally, as we'll see when we get into later parts of Jon's Clash of Kings chapters. And we're making this deal with Craster, and Corn seems like a badass, but also his men torture people. And you get that sense of, we're going to fail at this. And also underneath that, the question of, should we even be here? Should we even be doing this? And that's very much a slow burn in these couple of chapters, but I think the theme is present. What about you, Jeff?
Oh, well, first I want to compliment Matt for picking things that both you and I were interested in his little kind of thing. That's excellent. You calling the meta stuff for me, and then doing the Eldritch Apocalypse and the Lovecraftian themes for you. So that's excellent. Little clap for Matt there. Excellent job, sir.
I know you guys. I know what you want. Emmett wants the Eldritch stuff, and I got right there for it. Especially because that's just fresh in my mind. The old gods and how much they're familiar to Cthulhu and all the various weird things that come from the outer space sort of thing. Very similar to the Weirwoods if they were frozen in place. But anyway, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, but I mean, it's interesting. I think something we're all kind of coming around for these chapters about is that Jon's in kind of an interesting place in Clash. I mean, we were forgiven for thinking that Jon's will he, won't he over the Night's Watch has been resolved at the end of a Game of Thrones. But Jon's first chapter in Clash pushes this eternal conflict for Jon right back into the forefront, alerting readers that this is going to be a consistent theme in Jon's story, although not for Clash of Kings, I'll talk about here in a second. The twist here is that Jon's second temptation is not to join with Robb in avenging Eddard Stark. Rather, it's, will you, Jon, will you usurp Robb's crown? Will you attempt to gain a crown for yourself? And I find this shift kind of fascinating, right? And it gets me excited for events to come for Jon's arc in, I guess, The Winds of Winter, right? I think that's the thing about this chapter, right? Is that Jon 1 almost feels like a precursor to things that are going to be occurring in The Winds of Winter, where Jon will likely receive Robb's will likely be offered the crown at some point to become the king in the North. And to kind of see how all that setup is being built up here in Clash is interesting, right? Because for the rest of Jon's arc in Clash of Kings, he's not going to be facing this temptation. Most of his, in fact, the entirety of his arc going forward is all going to be about what he's supposed to do with the wildlings, what his duties are to the Night's Watch, how far is he supposed to take his vows, and what is he supposed to do with, people who probably should not be killed, like Ygritte. Is he going to execute her? Is he going to let her go? Is he going to join with the Knights? Is he going to stay with the Night's Watch? Or is he going to join the wildlings? But then, okay, so then we get to the second chapter, and I think this is kind of a little bit of a problem chapter. I don't mind it. I like it fine, but I find there's a bit of a tonal inconsistency between Jon 1 and 2. By the time we're in Jon 2, they're already in the fourth village that the Night's Watch has been to. And Jon's internal thoughts and external dialogue and action center around what's happened to the wildlings. And yes, it's great to have that kind of setup for events to come, mostly events in A Storm of Swords, not necessarily in A Clash of Kings. But I do wonder whether this chapter might have been stronger if the reader had time to marinate in Jon's thought process after that really impactful conversation with Elsie Mormont, where he's acting, and whether that would be acting in concert with the Night's Watch mission north of the Wall. That might have been a stronger thing for George to have done. But I do think, again, it's not a bad chapter. It's just one that I find like it's a little bit jarring to do for Jon 2 to be occurring right after Jon 1. We have no thoughts of Jon being like, well, and then Mormont said this, and this is what I'm thinking about this. Like, we don't get any of that stuff until like A Dance with Dragons, right? Essentially in A Storm of Swords at the end of that arc, where Stannis offers Jon to become Lord of Winterfell. It's kind of weird, right? Do you guys think it's weird, or is that, am I kind of out of place in that?
I definitely think it's weird, especially because we're skipping Jon's first journey through the Wall, right? Him going on this range and the first time he's ever walked through it. Like, why is that not this chapter? Why, like, all these conversations could have been elsewhere. The idea that he had to put it in the Wormways with Sam in the library, and then a redux of Elsie Mormont's conversation, and then in a random wildling village. It's like, the fact that it feels kind of unpolished, I would say, even for Gurm, is again why I think it's kind of, these were late additions where he got told he needed to put these kind of things in, and he went back and did it. Didn't have a lot of the gardening time he normally likes, because there's so much more impactful ways he could have done this. Even the show basically said, like, yeah, these chapters suck. I'm going straight to Craster's Keep, and it's like, yeah, that makes total sense.
I think it fits into what we've been saying about Clash of Kings on the whole, is that it's not as tight a book as a Game of Thrones, structurally speaking. But if you just break it down to the content and the individual scenes, I think it is stronger. Like, these chapters feel kind of amorphous in terms of why they're there and what the overall role is. But I don't think, with the exception of Jon's conversation with Maester Aemon, I don't think he had a scene in book one that was quite as rich as the conversations he has in this opening chapter here. So to get into the body of the chapters themselves, we start off in the Night's Watch library. And I think it's always worth noting when George calls our attention to the written word, he's probably making some kind of statement that we should be responding to. And the Night's Watch library is kind of a curious place to begin, given that the rest of Jon's A Clash of Kings chapters are concerned with this hard-bitten journey into the wild, not so much the kind of themes that come up in the library. There is a meta angle to this, and that's kind of surrounding Jon and Sam with pages from the start, emphasizes their status as fictional characters. And Sam, if the show's to be believed on this count, and I think it is the one who writes A Song of Ice and Fire. So that makes complete sense. It's like they're in this kind of liminal space between the book and the reader, but it also puts them in context with the history of the Night's Watch specifically. And it's something about which they both have valid and important points to make. I mean, it's easy on first read to feel that, Jon feels like he's just being kind of dumb on purpose almost, and Sam is the one who's cueing in. But I think they both have important points. Sam is right that you can actually learn a great deal from incidental details about people who lived in the past, and you can build up a lot of great history out of that. But Jon has a good point to make, even if he makes it kind of in an immature fashion, which is that they are connected by their setting and their task and their common humanity, that they were humans just like we are. And the same thing is true about the wildlings. They're humans just like you are. And you can think about that, I think, as like the two sides of storytelling, right? It's like you creating a world all your own versus connecting it to that of the reader. You've got continuity versus change, and heritage versus transformation. That's really what Jon and Sam are talking about. Mm-hmm. And part of that transformation is about getting past your narratives, past this dry, dusty history, your preconceptions, and the weight of prophecy bearing down on you, especially when it comes to the wildlings. Like, you have to forge your own path. Jon's understanding of the wildlings is going to transform hugely over the course of his story. And if season 8 is canon on this count, and again, I think it really is, he joins them in the end as he himself fades into legend and myth. So in that regard, even if this doesn't feel like a perfect foundation stone for his storyline and a Clash of Kings specifically, again, it does feel like it fits into Jon's characterization as a whole.
And to add on to that, I think we have a real benefit of being the readers of the story. We've read A Dance with Dragons. We know where this is going, that it's a high fantasy story, that's what's happening. If you think of it from Jon's perspective, yeah, I think has a good, I mean, I made fun of him, but he does have a point that, like, yeah, who cares about this dusty old information? Like, nobody really knows the others are back, or even where they came from. They haven't seen the scene where the children shove a dagger into his chest or anything like that. Like, why would he know this is important? It just looks like a nerd nerding out, which is fair, but from a meta level, it is very important going back that George dumped this information on us, especially in the Jon 1.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I mean, the other poignant aspect of Sam's journey exploration of the library comes in, like, how the books are actually described, right? They're faded and crumbling, and the scrolls are they kind of symbolize to me the decay that the Night's Watch has undergone. I mean, remember that back in the Game of Thrones, we learned that at one point in time during Aegon's conquest, the Night's Watch was 10,000 strong. And now the great might of the Night's Watch is 300 guys going north of the wall to confront Mance Rayder and his 100,000 motherfuckers. I think, we're in this place is in a bad spot. I think, like, the way that the library is set up and how we have all these crumbling manuscripts and crumbling books are helped to symbolize that. And then looking at the events that Sam was talking, Jon, about, it really indicates a much more vibrant Night's Watch, not just in terms of numbers, but in terms of trade, language, copying down books, doing all the things that, historical monastic lifestyle in Western Europe did, and also Eastern Europe and other places too. You got Valyrian scrolls, maps, and even a recount of trades, like we said, between the Night's Watch and the Children of the Forest. This all should be, like, fascinating stuff. And while Mormont's later going to cascade Sam for the old maps and how old they are, and then really, like, Mormont, like, shut up for a second. Like, why haven't you kept up the GIS branch of the Night's Watch here, man? I mean, like, you could be out there, like, having your Night's Watch Rangers there annotating new maps and things like that, but instead you're just bitching about how Sammo didn't find the best maps. There was only these old crumbling maps there. It's a great way to symbolize where the Night's Watch is versus where it's been, utilizing both how understrength the Night's Watch is, only 300, again, brothers are going to make the expedition north of the wall, and how it's not maintained its vital store of books. And Jon relates that the Night's Watch library has many more books than the Winterfell library, which I had forgotten the detail that the Winterfell library only had 100 books in total. That's kind of a small number of books. I mean, the Night's Watch library is going to be key and pivotal. It's too bad it's all going to get, destroyed by the others as they come south, of course. And Samuel points out that this is a treasure, and the Night's Watch has just completely disregarded it. Like, there's no one there but Samuel there, and he's noticing that people aren't really utilizing the library when they could be utilizing the library. And part of that is, again, something we find out in Game of Thrones, is that very few of the current crop of Night's Watchmen can read. Was it like 1 in 10 could read, and fewer than that could write or stuff like that, or command and things like that? Something that Mormont brings up to Tyrion in one of Tyrion's early chapters in Game of Thrones. So we're talking about an institution in complete decay and in isolation from the West of Westeros. And I think that's not good for the Night's Watch. And I think it's meant to show us how bad this organization is ultimately in the face of the apocalypse, right? This organization is in a bad spot with the others coming. Like, come on, guys, get your shit together.
Absolutely. Matt, you got some good notes on world building Castle Black if you want to follow up on Jeff there.
Sure. I really enjoy this. Me and Bookshelf Stud and Sen Rickson even did a whole podcast just about the Night Fort and what it probably was in the past. And you can kind of see that a lot with Castle Black here. It has a lot of towers, but it also has this, like, giant library that's been abandoned by the wall, which really, the fact that these books are just being left to rot and nobody gives a shit, even with the Citadel, literally an institution that only cares about learning. They have Maester Aemon there, and they're not sending people there. They're not sending people to go copy them. Like, surely they could have asked Aemon at any time, like, how many books you got? He could have said, like, a few thousand. They would have been like, we're going to send you some apprentices. We're going to take a look at that stuff because it sounds really interesting. Nobody cares about the Night's Watch. And just the idea that, but it's almost like, in a weird way, kind of like a northern citadel, where there's no collection like this outside of Old Town, basically. And just to think about the amount of effort that went into collecting them and holding them in place and caring for them, it makes you wonder, before the wall existed, because Castle Black and a lot of these castles are so very old, what were they before the others came? Like, it appears that the Night Fort pre-exists probably the wall itself, given the stories. Like, whose home was that? What was Castle Black for a long time? Did it always have that name? Like, you think about the Castle Oldstones. Well, it's called that because nobody remembers the name. Did they just call it Castle Black because that's the color? It could be something as stupid as that. What did it used to be? Maybe the Citadel used to be there, which I thought it's like an interesting like world building thing that's not really obvious, but when you go back, you're like, it is really weird that all these books are there. There's not even like a rich guy collecting them. It's just a bunch of nerds. I also thought that it was super interesting that in this chapter, Aemon is so heavily present, but he's not there helping. We know that he basically has memorized every book or close to it, knows exactly where they are in every shelf, and it's left to Sam and Jon to go down and find this stuff. And I think it's kind of like I was talking about how Elsie's plan seems kind of suicidal. Aemon seems to know that it might be too, and that his time might be up. So this could be like a kind of thing like, I need Sam to start to learn to fly, basically. I'm sending him out with the Ravens, even though it's not super important. I'm sending him down to the library to find stuff because somebody needs to do this when I'm gone, because he's very old at this point, and they may not survive. And that's kind of a bummer, but it's one of those things that Jon is not really thinking about, but you can probably imagine the commanders thinking about it. What's the next generation going to be like, especially if Mance is coming here? Somebody needs to be able to show the new commander what's what. Let's see here. What else did I write? I also loved the comparison here between Castle Black itself and the White Tree Weirwood, and how kind of similar they kind of are, where they're both giant and they're these massive repositories of knowledge, which we learn later the Children of the Forest use the Weirwoods as. They hold the knowledge of the world. Whether or not the show's version of that is right, that it's all in Bran's head, who knows? But we definitely know in the books that they hold like the souls of all their dead and all their memories in it. And it's interesting that as the Children of the Forest are being ignored and left to their own devices, the same thing's happening here at Castle Black. It's like the world is forgetting its own memories slowly. And it's even like the underground aspect, the wormways, which when we learn from Bran later, there's all these caves, that's where the Children of the Forest sit and dream, which is basically what Sam's doing here. He's sitting in the dark dreaming. Yeah,
that's great. That's a great comparison. It's that kind of hive mind aspect is something George clearly loves.
He loves it.
You see that crop up all across his works, even versions of it with the vampires and Fever Dream, and that's like the work of it that's most distant from that trope, and it still kind of works its way in there.
And one last thing that I thought was really interesting, it's basically like Jon is almost entering like a fantasy book himself through these chapters, where he had basically like a pretty normal life up to this point, and all of a sudden he walks out of the wormways and there's a comet overhead and the wall shining and there's a magical direwolf and magical raven looking at him. He's like, I'm going beyond the wall to meet the old gods. And it's kind of like he's like jumped into somebody else's story for a little bit from this point on. He's like gone into another dimension, another world almost. And that's very much a thing that I know that George loves doing. He loves thinking about these kind of, it's not explicitly a dream quest, but it's like almost like he's living one of Bran's dreams, sort of.
It's very liminal and feels kind of unreal. Like when Sam thinks to himself after he gets back to Castle Black and is resisting telling Jon what happened to Bran because he promised he's not dead, Jon. He's going beyond the wall through the Black Gate with his mysterious ranger protector on an elk. It sounds ridiculous, even as I'm thinking to myself. And yeah, there is that sense of a border between reality and fairy tale that I think does come through really strongly in these chapters. I think it's also just a great reintroduction of Jon himself to match that of Bran last. As you were saying, Matt, you can sense George trying to re-cement Jon in the reader's mind. All in black, he was a shadow among shadows, dark of hair, long of face, gray of eye. Black moleskin gloves covered his hands, the right because it was burned, the left because a man felt half a fool, wearing only one glove. Just a perfect little introduction. A shadow among shadows, given a Clash of Kings as a whole, that's probably not a significant choice of imagery at all. That won't crop later in the least. So Jon and Sam kind of emerge from this like liminal book space, little hive mind that they were in. Jon has a conversation with Donal Noye that we will get into towards the end of the episode. A very significant conversation where we want to deal with on its own. And then he talks to Lord Commander J.R. Mormont. And I love that he is reintroduced, bellowing that he is not too old to lead the ranging. And anyone who otherwise can kiss his bear-sized ass. Thank you very much.
It's like that Twitter thing where it's like nobody, and then Lord Commander Mormont's like, I'm not too old.
Exactly. That's the sentiment you're getting. Because, I mean, putting strategy and tactics aside for a moment, I know Jeff's going to frown at that concept, but even putting aside what Mormont is doing as a commander, I think his great ranging is being set up to fail just by clearly he wants to go out in a blaze of glory here. Just the way he's talking and conceiving about it. Like, he says he hates being cozened, flattered and lied to, but nor does he deal particularly well with the truth. Like, yes, he's smarter than the likes of Thor and Smallwood. He's also kinder-hearted than the likes of Thor and Smallwood, and that matters, but ultimately, like a lot of Jon's mentors, he represents a worldview that Jon has to work past as his successor. We see all of Mormont's blind spots and shortcomings brought up throughout this great ranging until he dies. Every step along the way, he's brought up against what you're both talking about, the decline of the Night's Watch. And even as he acknowledges that, like Jeff said, he was talking to Tyrion about how bad things have gotten, he still can't really face the consequences. He can't quite put the math together because the answer is just really dreadful and devastating to him, and he can't face it until literally he dies for it. I mean, like, yeah, he blames Sam for the maps being old, as if it's Sam's fault that the intellectual and strategic resources of the Watch have been in disrepair for a long, long time. Sam just got here, and he's not even in charge of this stuff, and yet he's getting blamed. And of course, what Mormont is really expressing here is insecurity, not about how old the maps are. It's about how old he is. That's why he has that line when he's laying out the Targ family tree. No, I still hadn't been born, although Jon didn't say anything about that. But that's what Mormont's feeling. At some level, the old bear feels he is too old, and he's reacting to that as so many people do when they start feeling old. They play act someone in their prime and force everyone else in their environment to play along. So long before the mutiny, I think you can sense how uneasy everyone is about playing along. You get that half joke that the comet is there to light Mormont's fool way into the haunted forest. And people are wondering, is there a real benefit to what we're doing? You have this instinctive fear and revulsion of going beyond the wall. And is Mormont providing enough of a counter to that? I don't think he is. On a more sympathetic level, the Lord Commander is, of course, trying to pass on what he knows before it's too late. That's why both he and Donal Noe are testing Jon via these parables of the questions of these other families and how they're going to reflect on you and your family. The Baratheon and Targaryen backstories are being reframed as cautionary tales for Jon. And his vows are being tested not in the context of his own story, but in Robb's. That's George kind of expanding outward, as Jeff was saying, about tying Jon into the War of Five Kings. They're perfect contrasts. They will garb your brother Robb in silk satins and velvets of 100 different colors, while you live and die in black ringmail. He will wed some beautiful princess and father sons on her. You'll have no wife, nor will you ever hold a child of your own blood in your arms. Robb will rule, you will serve. Men will call you a crow. Him they'll call your grace. Singers will praise every little thing he does, while your greatest deeds all go unsung. Tell me that none of this troubles you, Jon, and I'll name you a liar and know I have the truth of it. So the question is kind of ramped up from book one. It's not just what kind of man are you in the abstract. It's what kind of man are you specifically in a realm at war, which both connects Jon to the larger questions of A Clash of Kings and sets up his evolving relationship to the war between the Watch and the Wildlings that his later chapters in the book will focus on. And I love Jon's response to the Elsie that ends his first chapter in the book. He doesn't pretend that he isn't troubled. He says, I am troubled, but I'm sticking to my vows anyway. I'm not going to break and run. That's him doing the classic hero thing, the thing you're supposed to do to be a worthy protagonist, not pretend you don't have a shadow on your soul, but acknowledge it and bring it to the surface and be prepared to deal with it. I think that's the key to not only being a good hero, but it's the key to why good hero stories tend to resonate, because that's part of psychological maturation and making of yourself the best person you can be. And I think we see Jon prepared to do that here, which is good.
Agreed.
Yeah, very much so. One thing I thought that was really interesting about this, and Jeff, this actually came from me reading the doc before I read the chapter, and I went back to it, and it was the idea that Lord Commander Mormont is telling Jon that at some point he may usurp Robb's crown, and what that means about what he probably thinks the War of the Three Kings at this point will be, because especially when you compare this with the story of how Egg the Unlikely came to the throne. That's basically a story of how the last person anyone ever thought came to the throne. He was so far down the succession. And then you look at, oh, look, your brother is going to be king. He's going to war. A lot of your family's probably going to die in this, because Lord Commander Mormont saw the Robert's Rebellion. Entire families were wiped out. Jon might be the last one left, or it might be like him and Rickon. And he's sort of he's like preparing him, being like, when there's nobody left, when everybody's pushing you forward to be the Lord of Winterfell, and they need somebody to sit in that seat after the war is done and your brother probably loses, are you going to desert that at that point? And I think that's a really insightful point that George is layering in here, where he's connecting Aemon's story with Jon's in a very satisfying way. It's like, it just seems like Targaryen history. Who cares? Well, no, it's important for right now when you connect Jon and Egg as characters. Like, and whoa, Jon's name's Egg too. Oh my god!
It's like George is making a sword, and he's got to layer in all these different kinds of metal into Jon's story, and he's doing that now. And it might seem a little kind of clunky and obvious that that's kind of all he's doing in these chapters instead of pushing the plot forward, but it is really valuable stuff, and I think it's important to establishing Jon as a distinctive character in his own right.
What do you think about that, Jeff? Since that was going off your point.
No, I think it's really good. I think, it's fascinating to me. I do wonder like where George is at, whether he thinks how he imagines that Jon's going to take the crown itself. Because I think he actually has the idea pretty early on that Jon will be king in the North, or at least be tempted by it, right? That is something that is very clear from the get-go, that Jon is going to have some sort of royal question, so to speak. I do think that there is a bit of guarding that George integrates with Robb's will. I don't think that was originally part of the equation until George is like, how do I get Jon to be Sith Iron? Oh, wait, yeah, here we go. We're going to have Robb's going to write a will right before the Red Wedding, like literally like 2 chapters before the Red Wedding itself kicks off. And that's going to be the way that Jon's going to be able to gain like Northern support. Because I think it's hard. Like, it's one of these things that people are like very curious about when it comes to characters, like how Bran is going to potentially become king of Westeros, which I know that we've had some argumentation about, some debate that we can have at some sort of later juncture. But I think like George has yet to put as well of a reasonable pathway for Bran to become king of Westeros that he had, as opposed to Jon becoming king in the North. So you do kind of wonder whether like sort of the story was set up immediately to be like, okay, this is where Jon's arc is going to go. That we have Aemon's backstory being coming on here, how he was offered the crown, how like he ended up rejecting the crown. That ends up playing a big part in the backstory, and then will play a part in the future of the story going forward, which of course we'll talk about towards the end of this podcast itself.
Yeah, definitely. One thing that I thought was really interesting, just because it's hashtag on brand for me, hashtag on brand, I basically recognize Thorin Smallwood as Waymar come back to life. They're basically the same pompous dick southerner knight that's being a total asshole to everybody and thinking like we see him demanding to be first ranger, and we know Waymar went on his ranging because he demanded to go and also demanded to be put in command. They even wear like similar clothing. He even loots the Jeremy Riker's clothes so that he looks even cooler, which Waymar, being the third son of Jan Royce, is kind of a similar idea. It's someone dressed very well being a pompous dick that thinks well above what their commanders think. But in this case, because he's a Smallwood and he's not a Royce, Mormont gets his revenge and says, you can go away. Like, I don't have any reason to be nice to you. Your family's nothing. Your dad's not Jan Royce. Keep walking, Thorin. But it's interesting that he brought back that character that he really wanted to show with Alistair Thorne gone too, but a highborn jerk as a sort of, and it's kind of interesting. You can see him almost as how everyone else sees Jon.
That's a great point. I think so much of Jon's storyline in A Dance with Dragons is the struggle to understand how people see him and what he can do about that and what he can't. That's something that comes up with a lot of leaders in the series, of course. And yeah, Smallwood, it's interesting that George always kind of comes up with a lot of different Night's Watch characters to fulfill kind of the same archetype. Like, the Cotter Pike versus Dennis Mallister argument at the end of A Storm of Swords kind of has some embodiments of what's going on here. And you can tell George wants these kind of clearly defined tensions within the Night's Watch, in part because, of course, he's leading to the mutiny against Mormont. But also, it just suits his needs with Jon's characters that the Night's Watch is never just this unified block. He always needs them to be kind of contending with each other and unable to unite properly.
Yeah, excellent points. Agreed. Amen, brothers.
Gotta love Waymar coming back from the dead to be a jerk. And you really gotta think, like, every time that Jon goes into Lord Commander Mormont's like quarters, and he comes out with a sword, and like the people outside the door can probably hear the conversation, and they're probably like, nobody's supposed to talk to Lord Commander like that, but of course Lord Snow gets to. And Jon has the exact same reaction to Smallwood. He's like, who does he think he is? He's just some jerk. And it's like, yeah, everyone thinks that's what you're doing, by the way, but Lord Commander Mormont likes you better, so he lets you get away with it. I also I wanted to talk about briefly, what do you think Lord Commander Mormont's plan with this great ranging was? Because I really think it's a suicide run, and I think it's a suicide run, but with a purpose, because he knows he cannot beat Mance, he knows he cannot beat the Whites, but like I think he's like trying to make a headline almost, where it's like a letter from the north is going to make it to King's Landing, where like half the Rangers were wiped out in one night. Send aid, or else the wall is going to fall. It's like maybe that's the only thing he thinks he can do at this point, because he clearly can't win militarily. I don't know. That was just something I came across when I was reading it. I don't know what you guys think.
It's hard to. So Stephen Atwell's made this point. Again, we are basically the Stephen Atwell tribute podcast at this point. but he's said that it's essentially mission creep, right? This is like George's version of the Vietnam War for the Night's Watch, right? That they go north of the wall specifically to rescue Benjen Stark and bring him south of the wall, right? That's the original plan.
Yeah, but everyone knows he's dead. It makes no sense.
Well, Mormont doesn't Mormont say Benjen can find us easier than we can find him? Like, we're making a lot of noise, and we're lighting up our torches and moving through the wild, so maybe he can come find us. I think that's the closest we get to what Mormont's actual original plan is. And then once he finds out Mance is gathering everyone together on the Frostfangs, then he seems to completely change tack. That's just the sense I got off it.
Right, and then Mormont's all like, we're gonna like do this mounted attack against Mance Rayder and his 100,000 guys, and the fact that we're on horses means that we're going to prevail, which sounds crazy if you think about it. But then again, Stannis Baratheon comes north with 1,500 guys on horseback and defeats Mance Rayder in full combat. Right? I mean, Mance Rayder is already arrayed for battle against the Night's Watch, so it's not totally foolhardy, although it is, again, the numbers are really not on LC Mormont's side here. But again, that speaks to the mission creep, right? I mean, the one thing, from as a former and current military person, the one thing I have to say about all of this, of course, is that LC Mormont is abandoning the biggest advantage that he has, the biggest force multiplier, which is the fucking wall, man. Like, he's north of the wall, and he's abandoning that in favor of a mounted attack against Mance Rayder. What's actually going to defend the wall is the wall itself, right? The wall defends itself is what the point is going to be brought up, specifically in a Storm of Swords. So I think it's foolhardy. I am interested in the suicide mission idea. I don't know if it's a suicide mission per se. I do think it's more of mission creep. It's more like that they're like, okay, we're going to go find Benjen Stark. Okay, now the wildlings are massed. We're going to go attack them. Okay, now we all have to run away because the wildlings didn't attack us. The fucking others attacked us. So I think it's all sorts of things going on at the same time.
I think if it's a suicide mission, I don't think it's at a conscious level. I think that might be what he's doing under the surface at a level he doesn't even realize. But I think in his conscious mind, what he's telling himself, I think he does have a mission. It's just the fact that it keeps changing is what makes me think there is no real plan deep down. And this just might be a situation where he just honestly doesn't know what to do. So this is what he's going to do. This seems like the least bad option. This seems like everything his training and just class thinks is you're supposed to do. And Jeff's completely right that actually the smart move is to hunker down on the wall and hope you get support. But that's not what heroes do. That's not what great Lord Commanders do. That's not what figure of songs and legend do. They go out and fight, even if that's objectively not the smart move. And I think that in part might be what's happening with Mormont, is he really wants a legacy better than the likes of Thor and Smallwood. And that's in part why he seizes so much onto Jon. But so we go beyond the wall. We get to this village of White Tree. Here we are, back at the darkness at the edge of town, beyond the world, as Jon says, where we met the others and the Whites in book 1. And now no one's here and nothing happens. And I kind of do wish it was a little more urgent, but I do think George is making an important point about what Jon's task really is going to be beyond the wall, that he's here to cross borders rather than enforce them. That he's here not really to engage in daring deeds, because that's what Waymar Royce wanted to do, and look how that ended. He's here to learn about the wildlings, that ultimately Jon's story beyond the wall is not one of, heroic conquest. It's one of assimilation and one of cultural contact. That ends up being the focus. And you do get the beginning of that process here in White Tree, although more than anything, it's to take stock of what they don't know. As, the old air says, would that bones could talk, this fellow could tell us much, how he died, who burned him and why, where the wildlings have gone. And yet it is like, as you were saying, Jeff, like it's obvious why. He should really just be aware of that by now. But where the wildlings have gone is the key setup, because now we get this mystery element. Where is everybody? Where are all the wildlings? What are they up to? And that ends up being a thread we carry forward in later Jon chapters. And there's also just like some great uneasy atmosphere surrounding that just monstrous tree. This horrifying, huge, like everything else about this village is really small, right? Small village, small houses, not much, but this tree is massive. So it's like you've gotten this inversion of how things are in the South with these huge castles and like moderately sized weirwoods. And so, my only regret about doing these two chapters together is that George does this great setup in early in A Clash of Kings where we get 3 empty settlements in a row. Dany 1 with Vase Doloro, then Jon 2 in White Tree, then Arya 4 at the unnamed village by the God's Eye. So, that structure is nice, but I'll never pass up a creepy abandoned village, even in isolation. So if Jon 2 works in any way for me, I think it's mostly atmospheric and like, gets the hackles raised in the back of my neck and just gets me worried and paranoid about what comes next.
Yeah, and to follow up on that, in Jon 1, Jon really thinks about, he really looks down on the faith of the Seven. There's a scene where they're singing in their chapel, and he's like, they're singing, my old gods are hardcore and metal, and they're awesome, and so am I. And for him, the weirwoods he thinks about is the one Ned Stark sat beneath, where it has like that sad, mournful look, where it looks into the water, and it's like, it's not scary for him. It's home. It's a safe place. It's a place where he probably went to go find Ned, when he was feeling scared or something like that. And then he gets to this one.
Yep.
And this one is huge. It's his not in Kansas anymore moment kind of thing. It's terrifying. Not only is it huge, it has a gaping mouth with bones inside of it and ashes. And it's like, you can just sort of see Jon going like, wait, what are the old gods about again? Because like, this isn't what I know. This isn't the Winterfell heart tree. And it's really part of the Eldritch horror kind of thing I was talking about early on, where this is like the first time where it's like something that was comforting for him is now pretty scary and overwhelming for him to even deal with, where he also takes it personally a little bit, where Thorin's like, I'm going to take an axe to this thing, but he's still kind of in awe of the tree and like how big it is and like the features of it, that he doesn't even like shoot him an angry glance or like, those are my gods, like you imagine he would do at some point later. He's just in awe of what he's seeing. And especially when you compare that to the fact that he's gone to 4 villages and saw nothing, and they walk into this village and he's like, okay, all right, so I have to reevaluate some things right now. And he really does see them as holy. There's a weird moment where he comments on what the Night's Watch Rangers are doing underneath the shadow of the tree, and he notes like the light going through the leaves, and they're like, oh, they're staying around like pissing and scratching themselves, and he's like, this is my holy place, guys. Can you not do that? It's a similar thing to what he was doing to the grove when he swore his vows, but he's kind of backing off it a little bit. He's not really, again, he's not shooting anyone in glares. He's like, what have I gotten myself into? He thought he was just on a fun journey through nature, like Sam kind of thinks is going on. He's like, maybe the things Sam wrote or read in those books could be real, and I don't know what I'm getting into.
That's a point.
Go ahead, Jeff.
No, man, after you.
Oh, I was going to say, it's just, it's that complete inversion of what was once comfortable is now looks like it's going to devour you whole. And it's really interesting, that little bit with Thorin Smallwood where he says he understands why the first men would have taken an axe to it. It's like suddenly we're flashed back to the origin of all these problems, and we're getting back to that first decision being made. And you have the contrast with, you have one man, Jon, who looks at these things in awe. I mean, also fear, but also just kind of awe and reverence, versus Thorin, who just wants to cut it down and get it out of his way. And the Night's Watchman scratching and pissing under its branches. It reminds me of what the Queensmen, Stannis' Queensmen, say about the old gods when they get north. What kind of god allows himself to be pissed on by dogs? And part of me is like, of course you should be respectful of holy sites, etc. But part of me also thinks like, you should have the kind of god you can piss on, metaphorically speaking. You should have the kind of king you can talk back to. You shouldn't have these authority figures that are just so removed from you that you have to, be insanely respectful and walk on eggshells at all times, and you can't even be a human being around them. Like, part of the appeal of the old gods' faith is that they don't have the named gods, and they don't have the huge infrastructure built around them, and there's a sense of it being less corrupt, which I think is true. But that doesn't mean it's doesn't have just as much a blood-soaked history as the other religions. And Matt, you've always done a great job talking about that. And I do think, you're right. You see a strong hint of it in this chapter for sure.
And one thing I think that definitely. Oh, Jeff, sorry, were you about to say something?
After
Okay.
you two.
One thing that I thought was really interesting was John has this idea that the Weirwoods are a part of Winterfell, that they're a part of the Starks, that they are one and the same because of the way it's positioned. You know, it's in the Godswood, which is surrounded by a wall. It's within, you know, the protection of the Starks. You look at this village, though. White Tree Village is 4 tiny shacks with like piles of crap in the corner, and they have like hides over the windows, and they have sod for roofs. But it's the biggest Weirwood he's ever seen, and it's sort of, in his world, he thinks as the old gods as a thing that the first men own. And in this moment, he's saying, oh no, this one's much bigger and nobody cares for it. It's like, this thing's way more powerful than the people around it. It's grown out of control, and it's very much, I think you see later on him trying to struggle with the fact that the old gods and the others and all these big things are beyond what he understands as cool and tough as John is.
That's interesting. Yeah, I think, you know, last week we did Bran 1, right? Or if you guys are just listening to it now, if you guys are watching the live stream. And Bran has this dream where he says the Weirwoods are calling him, the Weirwoods that are not in the Godswood of Winterfell itself. So it's intended, like we said last week, to talk about the true power of the true North, right? Which is the North beyond the wall, and the power of the old gods. I think that's an interesting kind of statement about magic and about what is going on in Bran's arc, but it's also going on in Jon's arc too. It's also interesting too that Thorin Smallwood talks about putting an axe to this great weirwood tree, and this is something that's going to feature very prominently in Storm of Swords Jon 11, which our friends at the Girls Gone Canon podcast recently did with Scad from our other friends, the Davis Fingers podcast, which is an excellent episode, which is all about, like, Jon, you only need to cut down the weirwood trees, swear to the R'hllor and to Stannis, and you can rise as Jon Stark, Lord of Winterfell. Here, like, Jon's not like being like, oh, we cannot do this. These are where my old gods dwell. Instead, it's a place of reverence, but it's also a place of fear for Jon. Like, Jon's like, well, we shouldn't cut this down because we don't have time right now. But later it becomes much more reverent for Jon. I do wonder whether his time north of the wall and his experience with weirwoods ends up being something that drives him to later reject Stannis' offer for Winterfell, because he starts to see the power of his religion. Like we talked about, Jon's not super religious. Like, he talks about having a faith in the old gods, but he out and out does not really seem to groove with organized religion, which puts him at a great place, because the faith of the old gods is not an organized religion. So that's something that's interesting, I think, for Jon's arc, and I think it kind of parallels and intersects with Bran's arc too, and that they're both going north of the wall, they're both going to have experiences with Weirwoods, and they're both going to meet the old gods, whether they're the White Walkers or the Children of the Forest, maybe both. Oh, for Bran, definitely.
Absolutely. But, you know, the most important character in these chapters might not actually be Jon or Lord Commander Mormont or Maester Aemon. I think the most enduring part of this chunk of Jon's story is the introduction of the glorious Ed Tollett. Dolorous Ed, the funniest character in the Song of Ice and Fire this side of Stannis. And when I say Jon has the strongest supporting cast of the central POVs, as I've said a couple times on the podcast before, Dolorous Ed is high on the list of reasons why. As many people have noted, he's basically Eeyore as a Shakespearean fool. He's just wonderfully gloomy and has just these perfect puncturing things to say that just sum up everything that's going on in a way that no other character would. But what I also love about him is that he's more than just a trope. Like, when push comes to shove, he really is one of the finest of the Night's Watchmen. Mm-hmm. During that disastrous retreat to the wall in the Storm of Swords, when you got apocalypse and mutiny on every side of you, there's never a question of whose side he's on and who he's trying to help. Same during Jon's tumultuous time as Lord Commander, when people are taking a lot of different sides for a lot of different reasons. Ed is as secure and loyal as they come. So I like that for all his, gloomy refrains about the general dinginess of life. Like, that's from Edith Wharton's House of Mirth, the main character Lily Bart, which he's trying to describe like the horror of becoming poor and losing her social status. She always described it as dinginess, like that's the worst possible thing to be. And that's kind of what Ed talks about. Is not just that everything is horrible, but everything is kind of dingy and broken. Despite that, he's not a cynic. Like, he's like Yorn in that way. He really does care deeply about his friends and his brothers. He's, I think he's got the true heart beneath all those jokes.
And it's even, it's great. And the funny thing is too, like, we actually have the backstory for why Dolorous Ed joined the Night's Watch, and it all speaks to Dolorous Ed and kind of that, as you said it really well, refrains about the general dinginess of life. So in a 2001 So Spake Martin, George R. Martin was asked a question, just one question here. Why did he, that is Dolorous Ed, take the black? And George R. Martin responded, Yoren, remember him, Emma just referenced him, so you should, told him girls couldn't resist a fellow in a uniform. Yoren, though, well, he left out that part about the celibacy. So we have Dolorous Ed being kind of tricked into joining the Night's Watch, but yet, despite being tricked into joining the Night's Watch, he's the most solid guy that Mormont has north of the Wall, right? All these other great rangers, whether it's going to be Thorin Smallwood, whether it's going to be not Othel Yarrick, whether it's going to be other folks there who are scouting for him, leading the rear guard, all these different things, they're all going to die, desert, leave Mormont, get the fuck out of Dodge, but not Ed. Ed's going to stay there. He was tricked into joining the Night's Watch, and yet he's still staying strong. He's still there by the end of A Dance of Dragons, still standing strong for Jon, even though he's not at Castle Black itself.
He's the one who puts forward Jon for Lord Commander, right? Or at least claims he did.
Yes, it's a poor thing to do for a brother, but
Exactly. He's like masking his compliments and his sincerity in these cynical jokes, but the sincerity still comes through. Like, you have that line, it's a terrible thing to find a brother dead. And then he goes on to talk like about drinking the wine he found the person in. But that core line, it's a terrible thing to find a brother dead, is what he really believes. Like that's his soft heart. And he buries it beneath jokes to express that the gods don't care if you're sincere, that the world doesn't care if you're sincere and will always twist your designs around on you. So you meet fate armed in irony, not because it'll protect you necessarily, but so that not even death can come as a surprise. I think that's kind of what Dolorous Ed is doing by always talking like this. He's preparing himself to die and trying not to be afraid of it. This is his way. And he gets this gem of a line here about how tedious the dead would be. Like Mormont wants to talk to the dead, but they just be annoying and complaining about the size of their gravestones and why does he get more worms than I do? And that's just great. Not only because it demystifies the zombies that they're going to run up against, it also just calls into question the entire idea of venerating the dead and all the heritage and all the history that goes with doing so. Why are we elevating these people up above the rest of us? They were petty assholes in their time, just like we are. Why is it exactly that the memory of Aerys Targaryen or Elia Martell or even Ned Stark should rule the fates of the living? When we do that, are we imprisoning ourselves with them in their tombs? Should we not just try to move forward from them? And it's a classic Ed line in that it's both comforting and distressing at the same time. Like it's comforting because it's grounded. It's like it's an image of the afterlife, which doesn't involve eating brains or burning in a lake of fire, just complaining. That's kind of comforting, but it's also distressing, and it suggests we'll never rise above that we will be petty assholes for eternity and never find a higher cause. And that's just, I think that's a very distinct, that's the Dolorous Ed tone captured perfectly.
Right. And I love the idea too that in this chapter too, it's like, are the dead actually any better than us? Like why would they not be liars and just kind of malcontents the same that we are in real life? Like what's going to distinguish them? The fact that they're dead, like are people like their traits are going to be retained. And I think that's interesting, especially in a story where the dead do kind of rise to life on occasion from time to time, or rise to undead life, whatever it's going to be. That we have Ed here talking about, like, these guys are still going to be assholes, even when if they're assholes in life, they're going to be assholes in death. If they were good guys in life, though, they might be good guys in life too, or in death too.
Yeah, don't have rose-colored glasses, I think, is his overall, is what he's trying to get across in his uniquely Dolorous Ed way. For me, I think like the best Dolorous Ed line will always be what he says at the Fist of the First Men. Like Sam is wandering just through like the worst shit imaginable, just this utter apocalypse all around him and just chaos. And then in the middle of it, he sees Ed, just like a little Warhammer figurine, just sitting on his horse with his little banner. And Ed just looks at him and goes, Sam, would you wake me, please? I'm having this terrible nightmare. Which is great, because on one level, it completely undercuts everything that's happening by turning it into a joke. On the other hand, it expresses how terrible it is, because that's all Ed can think to say. That's the only joke he can make now, is please let this not be real, please. And it's just so good. So, this Ed is not exactly a super plot relevant character, but he is a fan favorite for a reason. And we're always going to take note of it every time he pops up.
Definitely the most down to earth person, I'd say, in the Night's Watch, where everyone else is fighting like their weird little political battles, or Jon's worrying about like what he's going to do with Robb, or if he's going to usurp. Lord Commander Mormont's thinking about his legacy. Sam's worried about books, and Ed's like, it's actually a really good line from the West Wing. This is going to be a weird reference, but there's a moment when CJ Craig is walking with Josh, and they're in the middle of, I think they just found out that Jed Bartlett has MS, and she just starts laughing. He's like, what's funny? Like, this is a very serious thing. She's like, you guys don't understand. You're like Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, like trying to figure out what you're going to do once you like land in the water and you swim away. It's like the fall is going to kill you. And that's kind of what Ed's doing here. He's like, we're all screwed this entire time. Like, our life sucks. And he's kind of cutting through almost like the fantasy like atmosphere of it in order to be like, somebody in this world have to not think they're like gonna be a hero of this story, and it's Ed. And he's like, yeah, this sucks, man.
And I love that line from A Storm of Swords where he's talking about another battle that takes place. He talks about the one ranger who's, he's like, yeah, he fell off the wall. It's a miracle that he wasn't killed by the wildlings when he took an arrow. Like, or what's he say? It's like, oh no, but actually the fall is the thing that actually killed him. He fell like 800 feet off.
Right.
Off
He missed the rocks. And we should think he's lucky for missing the rocks, even though he's just as dead.
Right, exactly. And I think that's what Matt's talking about here too. Is like the fantasy element there is like, oh well, of course he made it out alive. Right? It's like no, he actually was killed. I remember now. It's like the wildling axe had killed him before he fell off the wall. So it's like grounding this fantasy story in a very realistic tone, which I think is what some of George's strengths are. What one of George's strengths is, anyways. So I think that about takes us to our foreshadowing groundwork portion of this podcast itself. Hope you guys have enjoyed our discussion. I thought it was a lot of fun. The first thing we want to talk about, and I'm actually going to say just one line. I'm going to just turn it right immediately over to Matt here, which is that we had this line from Elsie Mormont where he's talking about that Aemon passes the throne onto Aegon. And does that foreshadow Jon passing the throne onto Brandon Stark?
Ooh, okay. So let me get some water.
Yeah, right.
So there's a lot. Thank you, Emmett. Thank you for taking water in solidarity with me.
Exactly.
George is incredibly clever with what he's doing right here, because he's setting up a very realistic possibility, like I was describing earlier, where it's like most of the Starks will probably die in this war. Civil wars rarely go well for the family that's trying it. And he's setting you up being like, oh, will Jon be like the Lord or like the King of Winterfell? And it's like, he's like comparing him, like, are you prepared to like usurp Sansa? Are you prepared to usurp Bran if that's the only one left at the end of this war? And he gets you thinking about that, and you're kind of turning it over in your head, comparing it with Aemon. But then it's like, oh no, by the way, it's actually Dany and Fagon that this is going to happen to. The secret Targaryen plot is going to come up, and it's not incidental that he's talking about Targaryens in this example. It's not incidental that a civil war will kill most of his family, and Jon's going to have to make hard choices. And especially with the idea earlier with the family he chooses versus the family he has. Dany is his family, and is he going to choose to make her family in the Targaryen way? Which, yeah, a little bit. But like, are they going to unite, or is he going to see her as a rival? And especially with Aemon's choice, where there's a lot that went into his choice that's below the surface, which I'll talk about in a little bit. But the one that Mormont says is basically that he thought that Egg was the better ruler, that he was more interested, that he would be better suited to the throne than Aemon because he's a book nerd. There's the line where he's like, he was slow at swinging his sword, which is kind of like a nonsense thing. It does anyway, but it's basically saying who's the right person to rule when it's your choice, when it's Jon's choice. And right now the choice is Robb, but down in the line it's becoming increasingly clear that no, it's going to be Jon whose choice will matter with who rules the Seven Kingdoms. Will it be Dany? Will it be him? Surprise, it's Bran, according to the show, which they said they got that from George. So, but even still, the idea that you should be comparing Aemon's life and his family to Jon's, I don't think is a very common one, but it's one that makes a lot of sense, especially like this is something I came across. I hadn't really thought about it. There's the exact same number of kids in the Stark family as there are in Aemon's family. There's 4 sons and 2 daughters. Because everyone forgets the daughters. There's two sisters.
That's true.
2 sisters, 4 sons. It works out almost exactly the same. And it's not really something you would think about, especially because it's planted so early on, where it's like this nonsense thing that goes away. Even like you compared Maekar to Stannis, but he's very much a parallel for Ned as well, as they are similar characters. And actually, even thinking about this, Maekar's wife was Deanna Dane, and Ned Stark's crush was Ashara Dane. It's almost like what would have happened if Ned had married Ashara, basically, and not ended up maybe in the neck with some kind of frog eater or something like that. Like somebody in the chat thinks. I'm looking at you. But I think it's really interesting, especially when you start looking at prophecy and how it works out for characters, where it really doesn't. And the choice, a lot of the characters take the choice. I think Chloe's going to ban me from this own chat. From this.
Well,
but a lot of it really does come down to choice. Like Stannis does not have to believe Melisandre. Dany does not have to believe the Red Temple when they tell her that she's Azor Ahai. It's really them accepting that into their heart and making it a part of their life. And that's a very, very important part, and it ends up crushing people that accept it. But Jon doesn't know any of this, and he hasn't grown up with the expectations that he will be a king. He hasn't grown up with the expectations that he'll even be a lord, like the leader of his house. So it kind of puts him in a unique situation that most of the claimants or would-be saviors are, where they all know it. And especially with Aemon, when you compare it back to him, the story about Aegon the Unlikely, Aemon was also extremely unlikely. He had no expectation he'd ever be on the throne, and he actually, like Jon, he turned down power at every turn. There was the Maekar wanted to put him on the small council as the Grand Maester. He said no. He wanted to put him on the small council anyway, just as like his personal maester. Said no again and went off with his brother Daeron, which is a whole different story that I'll get to a little bit. But I'll get to a little bit about why that's important and like the magical side. But it's very, very similar in terms of where their life is going. It's almost like old Jon meeting young Jon and like telling him what his life was like and how he ended up on the wall and how he made choices that were better for him and for the realm rather than seeking power, which is really what Aemon's story and his parable was about to him.
That's a great point. Like the same way like Stannis meeting Jon is like a cautionary tale. Like, here's what you could be, Jon, if you let your desire to be Lord of Winterfell consume you whole and become your driving force. And Aemon is the more, on the whole positive side that I think we're going to see Jon following. But I love that framing of Jon not as the endgame king himself necessarily, but as the one who makes the choice, and the one whose shoulders his lane, and then kind of Bran takes things from there beyond endgame into kind of an uncertain future. I think that strikes me as perfect, not only for those two characters, but as you say, in terms of their comparisons to the Targaryen analogs. I think that's really good.
I agree. I think like I think like people have been saying this in the chat too, but I never caught the parallel between the number of children that Maekar has versus what Ned Stark has. So kudos to you, man. It's awesome.
Thought of that today while I was putting it on. I'm like, wait a second, how many kids in Maekar had? And I started counting. I'm like,
that's really, yeah.
And there's even, getting back to Daeron, like I was saying, Daeron is probably the closest Bran analog, especially in terms of what's important about them. And this was something that Aemon kind of hid from the world, which I thought was really, really interesting, especially because as we saw Bran in season 7 and 8, like he sort of told people what he was, but he didn't really clue them in. Daeron was legitimately a prophet. He saw the future and it came true. And that was the whole reason he was a drunkard. He tried to have dreamless sleep. That was the whole reason he was drunk all the time. And that fact impacted Aemon and the rest of the Targaryen line so much. Like the idea that Aemon chose Daeron over the small council sort of seems like, oh, he's just trying to help out Daeron. He wants to make him become a king. But then you realize, no, Aemon actually is hugely interested in magic and prophecy, and he has a prophet brother. That's probably not a choice that was just one thing, like it's presented when Mormont says it.
Yeah.
And the history said he's a multi-layered person, and the layer he always hides, kind of like Rhaegar does, is his interest in prophecy and magic and how he thinks it affects him. So when you're talking about Jon and Bran, you can sort of see he's gifted. He is a warg, but he is not Bran gifted. And Aemon had dragon dreams, but he did not have Daeron's dreams. So you can kind of see similar characters where what would have happened if Daeron had been king and he wasn't destroyed by it? What if he had a tutor like, oh, hey, Bloodraven's there. Someone that can show him the way. And what that means, especially with the connections to the old gods, like Daeron being a dreamer, going back to like a very important person in their house is obviously Daenys the dreamer, the one who saved them from the doom. So Daron being a seer would actually be very powerful, especially when you know how much the Targaryens are interested in magic and looking at this stuff and trying to see the future. Crowfoot's daughter did a great job showing how it didn't start with Aerys the First. It started probably all the way back. They've probably been doing it the whole time. It's just that they call them bookish, basically, when they actually mean they're magically nerdy. And they're trying to like, kind of like a, this is actually going back to the Lovecraft point. They're probably very similar to Lovecraft characters who are like sitting in dank dungeons and reading spells and doing weird chants and trying to make the dragons come back and all this other kind of stuff. Because that's what George knows as what magic is kind of like. So, to come back to Aemon and Jon, it's very telling that Aemon gave up the chance for power to try and give it to Daron, and then gave it to Egg too. He's like, both times he's like, it isn't for me, it's for these two guys. It should be for Daron. He has the gift of future sight. That's unbelievable. A king with that would be, well, this is my theory anyway, but that's not actually canon. But then with Egg too, where on a more practical level, he was like, Egg already has a family. Egg is a stable person. Egg has a good heart. He's the one that should be king. And you can definitely see Jon making that choice with Bran and maybe Sansa too. I doubt she'll have a family at that point, but she's much more, I would say, the Egg character if you're comparing the siblings, if you're trying to match them up, kind of like that. Whew.
Yeah, that's all I have to say is yeah.
I mean, I think it's interesting in terms of George's question of what kind of person should be a king. Is it preferable to have like a more kind of soldier-oriented person like Jon, or a magically oriented person like Bran? And I think, a lot of it comes down to the structures they're given to manage their power. And Daron was never given a proper structure to manage. And you can see Jon kind of constantly looking for a new place to be and a new way to understand himself. And that's something that you see with the Targaryens. I think you're making a good point that they had this structure in place, and it was more a burden on them than anything else, especially when they were aware of it. And that it didn't necessarily, I mean, it empowered them in some ways, but it ultimately turned on them. And that's the kind of question in terms of Jon's relationship to these Targaryen characters is ultimately comes down to his relationship to power and how much of it he's going to want and how much of it he's going to accept.
And especially when you're thinking about it, when he meets Dany and Fagon, and how he's going to see them. And he had kind of a very brief version of this in season 8, where he's like, oh, am I stamped with madness or something like that when I'm born? The Aemon made a lot of choices to go this way. And that's kind of why when you see him in A Feast for Crows as he's dying, he has all these regrets, and they really weigh on him, because he realizes, probably like Jon will in the future, like his 10 years later thing, well, Aemon's had like 60 years to think about it. And how's he feeling about those choices, about not seizing power himself and giving it to other people? May not go that well for old man Jon, however old he gets now that he's a white, God knows. Could go forever.
It could indeed go forever. That would be interesting to see whether being a white's going to mean that Jon's has become eternal, with the same way that maybe Bran has too. If Bran ends up fading into the werewoods or something like that down the road, who really knows? Do we want to talk briefly about the old bears before we transition to our final conversation? We can pick up some more.
I'll jump on that real quick.
Yep.
A little bit of foreshadowing here is Mormont's line. I've seen the dead walk. I've not seen any giant bears.
Yeah.
He will. And I just love, you can tell how excited George is to get to one of his best horror images, the bear on the fist of the Horseman. Whenever he came up with that, I'm betting he was going, oh, this is good. It's so scary and metal and over the top. And he's just putting it in here. And even beyond foreshadowing, I feel like this is just, he's too excited. He just can't resist putting a little reference into it there.
Yeah, you do kind of wonder, like, I do think that this is definitely something that George planned to show, of course, because of course when the bear shows up, it's supposed to be like, Mormont, this is kind of like your comeuppance right here. You have a giant fucking bear, the one that you didn't even believe existed north of the wall, coming to attack you. Also the symbol of your house too, also coming to attack you as well. Like, maybe you made a mistake in coming north of the wall with the great ranging. But these are all topics for A Storm of Swords proper when we get to that event in the prologue, as well as that event come of Samuel's first chapter in A Storm of Swords, to see where it counts that. So that about wraps us up for our foreshadowing groundwork portion of this episode. We can talk more about all of the Aegons and the Daron II versus Ned Stark versus Maekar Targaryen versus Aemon versus all these characters in the Q&A afterwards for for our folks who are watching on YouTube. To kind of take us into the more theory discussion or final portion of this podcast, we did want to talk a little bit about that metaphor, right? About Donal Noye's metaphor, about Robert being the true steel, Stannis being iron, and Renly worth copper. And the question is the metaphorical metallurgy, is it a yay or nay type question? Is Robert the true steel? Is Stannis the iron who's going to break? Is Renly worth a damn? And he's not.
That one's beyond reproach, apparently.
Is this the price I pay for getting to talk about Aemon for like 10 minutes straight? I have to now talk about this. Okay.
Absolutely. Well, it's interesting stuff in terms of how George conceives of these characters in relation to each other. I mean, something we've talked about before about how it feels like Robert's legacy was kind of cut in two when he died, and we got Renly and Stannis as kind of like these two halves, the ghost and the shadow. And I think you can definitely see George playing with that idea here. I think there's an interesting contradiction between Robert being the true steel and him going to trust as soon as he has to do anything except fight. I mean, I think that gets up, and I don't know if Donal Noye really realizes he's kind of giving this away. I think that gets at the problem with a martially oriented cast being in charge, that the best soldiers don't necessarily make the best kings. Like Bran wanted to be a knight, but it looks like he's going to end up as king long after that dream is dead. So maybe George is suggesting that people who love war and invest themselves in war can't necessarily rule the peace. So I think that's an example where maybe we're not supposed to take Donal Noye at face value, but maybe despite that, he's getting at some important truths without even realizing it.
I think you're right about that. I think like Robert as being the true steel, like I think it's interesting that okay, so back up. First, I think that it's interesting to get the perspective of Donal Noye, because when was the last time he actually saw these guys, right?
Been a while.
I mean, 17 years, right? Robert is 34, 35 at his death. You know, from what we understand, Donal Noye leaves the Baratheon brothers' service after the Siege of Storm's End at 283, after he loses his arm during the Siege of Storm's End. So it's been a good long while since Donal Noye has been acquainted with his sons, I guess, so to speak. There's like a lot of people are claiming the Baratheon boys as their sons, right? From Crescent to Donal Noye to, I guess, Stefan Baratheon, who apparently existed at one point in time. Like, there's a lot of folks here who are thinking that the Baratheon boys are their sons. I think that's interesting. I think that perspective, when we get beyond like whether Donal Noye is being correct or not. Does he actually know anything about like a character like Renly? I mean, you assume he knows Robert and Stannis like a little bit better, given that the kids were like 18 and 19 years old during Robert's rebellion, and that he was with Stannis at the Siege of Storm's End. So is he actually being accurate here, given the circumstances and the timeline and the time that's passed since he actually encountered these boys?
I have a quote for this, and I think it's also important to, like you're talking about, how long it's been since he's seen them, but also who is Donal Noye as a person? What does he value? What are the things he cares about? Well, he's a blacksmith. He was a blacksmith and a weaponsmith for Storm's End, and then he went and joined the Night's Watch. So he's basically spent all of his life kind of around soldiers, and that's basically his perspective. Those are the things he really values. So when you consider the three of them and their relative strengths and weaknesses, yeah, Robert is by far the best warrior. He was muscled like a maiden's fantasy, like Ned says, which is a troubling thing that Ned says about him, and probably means some other things. But anyway, he's like 6'6". He's basically a giant. He swings his warhammer and kills everybody. He's using Donal Noye's warhammer too. It's like there's probably a lot of pride. He probably felt a lot of pride in Robert's conquest up until he started turning into a bad king. But those are the things he really values. And there was a really good quote from Game of Thrones, Jon 5. And I think it's interesting that George put this in another Jon chapter for a comparison. And I believe this is Jon's talking to Maester Aemon. And he says, "This collar is supposed to remind a maester of the realm he serves. Isn't that so? Lords are gold and knights steel, but two links can't make a chain. You also need silver and iron and lead, tin and copper and bronze, copper, and all the rest. And those are farmers and smiths and merchants and the like. A chain needs all sorts of metals. A land needs all sorts of people." And I think that's really what's getting at what Donal Noye is saying about Renly here, where he says he's copper. He is not a warrior king. He will never be. That is not who he is. He's a very different kind of king. He's like the difference between like Aenys and Maegor, but like much like smaller extent. Like Robert's not Maegor, neither is Stannis, but it's like the difference between a martial person and a person that has much more a liberal arts degree, I guess would say, rather than someone who joined the ROTC like Stannis and Robert. And apparently Jeff. And I think that's important for taking into account, and especially when these quotes comparing the metal are all in Jon's POV. So George is intending us to think about who's saying it, and kind of, it's like almost the faith of the seven, where you need all the seven. You can't just have the warrior to have a balanced life, which is sort of the idea behind the seven.
That's a good point. I mean, it's true that Renly hasn't had the opportunity to fight in a war like Robert and Stannis, but I think Renly, the liberal arts major, is more the show. Like, Renly in the book is still a big dude, a martial dude who trains and is in tourneys. I mean, he's certainly not as tied to the warrior king model as Robert and Stannis, but the line I quoted from him earlier about good soldiers don't make good kings, I don't think book Renly would necessarily touch that, because he still wants the image. He still wants to look like Robert, even if he's not super there. And yeah, I mean, I think you both make great points about that. We have to consider how long it's been since Donal Noye saw these people, and we have to consider that Donal Noye is not this neutral observer who has no values of his own. He's bringing value judgments to the table. It's worth noting, I think, that Donal's criticism of Renly lines up perfectly with what Olenna says, that he knew how to bathe and knew how to dress and knew how to smile, and somehow he got the notion in his head that this made him fit to be king. And she knew Renly the man very recently. So that makes me think that Donal might have been onto something, even if it's inadvertently. But on the whole, he's doing a lot of judging from surfaces, and I think he is kind of accidentally getting at the truth. And I think that gets at how hard it is really to evaluate public figures, especially in like this pre-modern era where you might never even see them. And he's kind of working on reputation, and that I think that comes to the fore when he talks about Stannis, because I think he's both right and wrong about this. I think, as Jeff has pointed out very extensively and well, Stannis does actually bend before breaking at certain points in the story. I think they might represent hypocrisy as much as they do progress a lot of the time, as he himself points out to Davos. Like, yeah, isn't it funny that I learned how to forgive people right when I needed them, but I didn't learn how to forgive you for smuggling? Isn't that kind of an awkward hypocrisy on my part? On the other hand, though, I think it's, like Matt was saying, got to consider what Donal Noye's life experiences are. So when he's talking about Stannis would break before he bent, what is he talking about? He's talking about the siege of Storm's End, right? He's not talking about Stannis making political concessions down the line. That's what he has in mind, the guy who would starve first. And maybe this is complete supposition on my part, but maybe he's specifically thinking about Davos's fingers, not the wonderful podcast, the literal fingers. Because as we've said before, Donal Noye was presumably there at the siege, at the conclusion, when Stannis did that. So maybe he's thinking, geez, the dude who cut the fingers off the guy who saved his life, maybe he's a little too brittle. Maybe he doesn't have, the Robert's finest attribute, I think, was his capacity to forgive and to bring people over onto his side who were previously fighting against him. And Stannis, as he says in Storm of Swords, just looked at that like it was magic and didn't know how you could even begin to conceive of doing that as a person. So, yeah, I think this is obviously a much discussed and much analyzed and much argued part of the text. And I think what makes it work for me is it's neither a complete fabrication on Donal Noye's part, nor is it the exact truth. I think he's getting at something, but I think all three of these guys are slightly more complicated than what he's suggesting. And I think they also just have much more in common than what Donal Noye is talking about. I think, Stannis and Renly are opposites in so many ways, but as Tyrion says, the real reason they can't get along is because they're too much alike. Is because they're so equally stubborn and both want the room to stop when they walk in, and they can't deal with it being any other way. And they also kind of get that from Robert. So, I mean, one of the things I like about a Clash of Kings and A Song of Ice and Fire as a whole, it doesn't pretend it has the one answer to Varys' riddle. There isn't this one completely perfect way to conceive of power. In any way you look at it, you're always going to be incomplete. And Donal Noye's monologue feels like an example of that to me.
I think it's a fantastic point. I think Matt's point too about how all the metals are supposed to work together is a really good point as well. They all have value at some level, right? If you could put Robert and Stannis and Renly all together as to one person, you got yourself basically the perfect king, right?
The Megazord of Baratheons.
All the colors together, all the parts of the Maester's chain. You need all the metals, and Renly's just the copper, and Stannis is just this iron, and Robert is just this part. And the tragedy, is that you can't forge them together into one chain, one realm, one god, one king, one realm, all that nonsense. You can't quite get it done with any one of them. And yet they don't work well enough to get along because they're not the Starks. They don't have that unity, that family pack mentality dragging them through all else. They just don't have it.
I also find it interesting, since we were talking earlier about King Bran and Jon's choice in the endgame, Donal Noye would probably hate that choice. He would say, you made the wrong choice putting Bran on the Iron Throne.
Can't even walk.
Yeah.
How's he going to be the proper warrior king of Westeros?
How's he going to swing a sword? I can make him a sword. It'd be great. And it's like, well, no, that's not his skill set. And there are quite a lot of people in Westeros that really do want warrior kings of old. They love Robert, despite his many, many faults. And there are things to not like about Renly. I said it. Guys, I said it. There are things not to like about Renly. There are parts of his kingship that probably would have been pretty bad, as there are with everybody. Nobody's perfect. But like, it really does matter about what kind of realm you think they were going to build and what their kingship was going to be like. Like even him saying like Robert's the true steel. Robert bent over backwards for Tywin Lannister for like
Littlefinger
and Littlefinger for like 14 years. And this is the guy that Delanoy is like, that he's the true steel. He's the great guy. Well, yeah, like Jeff said, he hasn't seen him in a long time, but also like that's a part of Robert's character too. And this is a very, like you said, this is a very popular line and it's a great one to discuss, but yeah, these are not like comprehensive looks at them. And even like I said, like George is presenting many different angles on this whole metal as a ruler king society sort of trope he's using throughout the books.
I think more than anything else, it might be most reflective of their end games, that it's about Robert ultimately going to rust and Renly ultimately isn't worth that much and Stannis ultimately will break despite bending several times along the way. His end game is burning Shireen, and if he survives that, he will presumably be a broken man until the moment he dies, probably shortly afterwards. So yeah, they don't act as perfect summaries of complex characters, but they might reflect. They might be like George, just like flicking past the curtain, saying, "Hey, here's where I'm going with. Here's where I went with Robert. Ultimately, here's where I'm going with Stannis and Renly. In case you're curious."
Agreed there. So I think that about wraps us up for the main portion of this episode of the Notcast podcast. And for you guys who are in the chat for our YouTube portion, we will stick around for a little bit. Matt, if you're able to join us for a few minutes to answer some questions and chat with the folks who are here in the chat, we'd appreciate it. As always, thank you so much for listening to our podcast. Thank you for Matt for joining us. And Matt, where can we find your shit on the internet, bro? The internet? Yeah, where is it?
Where on the internet? So I have a YouTube channel, youtube.com/JoeMagician. I did a lot of stuff for Game of Thrones, the season 8 as it came up. I'm getting back into more Song of Ice and Fire things. My upcoming video is kind of like a simple question, but I found it has a lot more to it. It's like, with the defeat of the others and the dragons leaving Westeros ostensibly, does this mean the seasons are going back to normal? And it kind of gets to why are they out of whack? What has George said about it? And were either of those forces really in control of what was happening? And it's gotten me to an interesting magical meta place, which I always enjoy getting to. And there will be some other things. There's going to be the murder mystery on Dragonstone. The what's his name? The guy that poisoned everybody in Fire and Blood. Farwind.
Farman.
Farman, yeah. Like who was behind that, who gave him the poison, that kind of stuff, and also how to take Storm's End. Jeff has his own ideas about how Storm's End will be taken by Fagon. I have a different one.
Excellent.
Which actually Jeff likes. He's heard it before. You can also find me. These are all also available as podcasts. You can find them on iTunes, Google Play, Spotify as The Wit and Wisdom of Joe Magician, because I am so original. That's what I chose as the podcast name. I needed something. You can also find me on Patreon, patreon.com/JoeMagician, where I have, I would say, similar perks to kind of what Nauticast and History of Westeros do. I have my own Slack. You get like stuff early, you get bonuses, etc., etc. So if you like this kind of stuff, I do talk about Aemon, Targaryen's prophecy, magical. That's kind of my whole jam. Well, not all of it, but a lot of it. A lot about Jon. And also you can find me on Watchers on the Wall, where I contribute as a feature writer. So kind of whatever I kind of feel like that I don't want to put on my YouTube channel kind of ends up there. And Maester Monthly podcast with Glass Table Girl and Bookshelf Stud most of the time, but you can catch most of the moderators there, at least the ones that want to. Sometimes even Jeff shows up. He's a moderator of A Song of Ice and Fire, you guys. I bet you didn't even know that. Which we keep trying to demod him, it won't work. Yep. So that's all the places I think you can find me at the moment. Yep. That sounds like all of them.
Awesome, man. Well, again, it was a real pleasure to like have you on the episode itself. I think I learned a lot of stuff today. I'm still kind of like my hair is still kind of blown back by the whole idea of the Targaryen family resembling the Stark family. I think that's really, really cool. And we can talk about that more in the after episode portion itself.
Absolutely. So, should we want to do the rate and review us, Jeff? Because it's usually yours.
Yep. As always. So thanks again for Matt for joining us. As always, please rate and review us on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, SoundCloud, Podbean, anywhere and everywhere you find your podcasts. You can find our Patreon at patreon.com/NotaCastASOIF. Did I fuck you up? I fucked you up, right? That's your line, yeah.
From there. Follow us on Twitter at NotaCastASOIAF or shoot us an email at NotaCastASOIAF@gmail.com. You can find me at Port Quentin on Twitter.
And you can find me at Brendan Bfish on Twitter, Brendan Bfish on Reddit, and my website is warsandpoliticsspiceandfire.wordpress.com.
We would like to give our shout out, as always, to our high lords and ladies on Patreon. Lord of the Squishers and Warden of the Deep, Lord Quint Esquire, the Wolf in the West, Sir Sorsadelica, Lady Veneris of the House Culgarian, the first of her name, the Overworked, Queen of the Pencils, the Eraser and the First Draft, Queen of Monochrome, Devotee of the Great Game of Thrones, Portraitist of the Realm, Lady Realist of the Seven Kingdoms, Creator of Arts and Maker of Drawings, Lady of 1,000 Words, Septon Eastwood of Introvert Isle, Septon Maribald, the Shoeless Sage, Lady Madeline Rivers, Justiciar of the Trident, and Sister Winter, Lady of the Wolfswood. Thank you so much, as always, to our high lords and ladies for your support. We really appreciate it.
Yes, indeed. So join us next week as we head down to River Run to reacquaint ourselves with the woman who only did one thing wrong in her entire life, Lady Catelyn Stark. And we will learn some troubling news about the start of Rob's reign. And we'll be joined next week by none other than returning guest and champion, Stephen Atwell. Stephen Atwell is coming back to join us for Catelyn 1, which is going to be a whole lot of fun. Cannot wait to have Stephen back with us.
For sure. Atwell, as Jeff was saying earlier, is definitely kind of, I think, the number one influence on our podcast, both in terms of structure and on content. We've had a great time having him on previously for an Ed chapter, a Dolorous Ed chapter, I wish, for a Ned chapter and at the Catelyn chapter at the end of Game of Thrones. And Catelyn 1 is a great chapter full of questions of kingship and justice and peace and war, all those great themes that Atwell has written a lot about. And I love Catelyn's chapters and Clash of Kings to pieces. So yeah, can't wait for that.
Absolutely. So thank you guys for listening. We will see you guys next week. All right. We'll go ahead and stop the audacity.
Okay.
And now we can just take our glasses off, go from Clark Kent to Superman.
Wait, you go from Clark Kent to
right?
Relaxing? Aren't we going from Superman to Clark Kent right now? Shouldn't we be putting glasses?
Well, if I took the glasses off, so I'd be going from Clark. Whatever. The metaphor is fucked. We fucked the metaphor.
It was fucked when you compared yourself to Superman.
Right. Exactly. That was the first problem. So we've gotten this question a couple times in the chat from Charles EA, so I wanted to make sure we get to it. And the question was, did Stannis love Robert and Renly more than they loved him? I think Stannis probably loved Robert more than Robert loved him. I think that's probably was the initial fault line in their relationship. At least Stannis feels that way. I don't think he ever particularly loved Renly. I don't think Renly ever particularly loved him. I don't, except at a very deep level that Stannis only realizes after Renly is dead. I think the Baratheon. I don't get the sense it was ever good, like with the Baratheon brothers, and only now have things fallen into disrepair. I think for a number of reasons, I get the sense the bond was never there.
They just seem like kind of a shattered family, especially after when Stefan and I don't even remember what's his wife's name, Cassandra, when they die on the ship, and Robert, I mean, he's the Lord of Storm's End at that point, and then he goes off to be fostered in the Vale, and it's like just kind of leaves him behind. And this is the time when they probably needed their brother the most. Like as they're growing up, there's no one left. It's basically just Crescent, and Robert's like, "Peace, guys, I'm gonna go hang out with Ned." So I doubt there was a lot of love for Robert for his brothers, and he doesn't really show it ever. I mean, he promotes Renly and Stannis, but I think that's more like countering the Lannisters than it's any like personal affection he has for them.
Yeah, agreed there. I think, again, it's a missed opportunity. They could have been a powerful team. Like I always go back to how Doran describes him and Oberyn as the grass and the viper, and people with really different skills working together for the benefit of the family. And the Baratheons could have been that, and yep, just never was.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to try something here real quick. See if this works. There we go. You see that?
Interesting. Yeah, I see it.
Oh, look at that.
Apparently I could do this with this new thing. So David Howlett is asking me about my general stance about the sack of Constantinople during the Fourth Crusade. Was it premeditated or a mere opportunistic act? And and a chain of similar acts? Well, it's a complicated question. I am not a huge sack of Constantinople guy necessarily, but I do think like it's a this is complicated. We'll get offline. Come DM me. We'll talk about the sack of Constantinople on Twitter.
I feel like Matt during the medals discussion from Illinois. It's like, I have nothing to contribute here.
Nope.
Carry on.
I just found that quote. I searched for the word copper, and I was like, this has to come up somewhere. George has to talk about copper. Actually, I was trying to figure out which Maester medal it was, because you can find out with steel and iron, where I was like, is he saying something particular about Renly? Like, is he like good with like money, or is like what kind of, and it doesn't say. And I came across that quote, and I'm like, oh, that's actually a really good quote. Thank you, George. That works nicely for my argument.
We have Lady Erin M, who asked, do you think the Targaryen women who were born, quote, simple had anything to do with dragon dreams? It always struck me as interesting that there were no simple Targaryen men. That's a Matt question for sure.
Definitely. The histories for the Targaryens, which again I credit Crowfoot's daughter for kind of picking this up, is bookish and simple almost always means in the Targaryen history that they were into magic or they had dragon dreams. Because like Daeron, he was basically incapacitated by his gift. I mean, he's sort of functioning, but not really. Like we see him in the Hedge Knight, and his life is falling apart around him, and he accidentally causes the death of his uncle. And it's like, that's like almost the best case scenario for someone with their prophetic gifts. Like worst case, you would be considered simple, because it's almost like again, like Lovecraft. And I know you're loving this stuff. There's quite a few Lovecraft stories where the people that get visions of the other worlds and the other dimensions are they just ignore the world around them because all they see is the dreams. And you could definitely see that happening.
I think a lot like crazy and mad. Simple is a term that we use without any real concrete definition of what it means. And we should just kind of acknowledge that up front, that like people are saying in the chat, does this person count? Does this person count? It's a word that, is imprecise in its meaning. And it's always a difficult question for me with those terms that come up in George's use of the series. I think they're useful shorthand and fit the era well, but I don't think they help us understand the characters necessarily. So yeah, I'm not super fond of that construction on the whole. Bring up the good point that Rhaegal Targaryen, brother of Aerys the First, might fit that category. But yeah, as Charles E.A. is saying, they never called him simple. They say something lines of poor and mad. So what do any of these words really mean? I think is
yeah. I've got that theory that Aerys II wasn't mad, that he was kind of like Daeron. He's being driven insane by visions that he had no control over. So even the word mad could mean these things as well. It's Georgie's like uses these like little trick words sometimes for descriptions.
Very true. And even then it's like, okay, but Daeron wasn't a sadist and Aerys was, so how do you factor that in? And
I guess he saw Summerhall, who knows. None
of these things have precise answers.
Nope.
And then we have a question from Lady Madeline, Justiciar of the Trident, who asks, what I asked from earlier, in which book do you like Jon's chapters the most? Well, Dance.
Very good, gentlemen.
Very good. Yeah. Good.
Jon's arc in Dance, I think, is really where you see where George is going with him, and he's not just on ice, so to speak, and not just being prepared, but actually forced to do leadership. And I think he does, as Adam Feldman has pointed out in his essays, does a great job of having Jon wrestle with what the right thing to do is and where his loyalties really lie, all that good stuff. And I think the end result of it is something really interesting, where you see Jon doing what seems like the objectively right heroic thing to do from one angle and a completely wrong disastrous thing to do from another angle. And I think that's really powerful stuff.
And I would describe, I have like just like we were just talking about, I have trick words for how I think about Jon in like one word for each of the books. Game of Thrones, he's angsty. A Clash of Kings, he's boring. A Storm of Swords, he's horny. And A Dance with Dragons, he's sad. And the sad one, I think, is the better one.
Sad
Nicely put. Good. Sad is always good. True. It's a good motto.
Well, George writes sad, I think, better than most emotions he writes.
That's a good point. Yes, agreed. I think probably better than he writes horny on the whole.
He's not good at horny.
not especially.
Not good at happy either.
Nope. Happy doesn't work for him.
All right, we have a Song of Ice and Fire question from our new small counselor, Lord Stephen, whose actually title I forget off the top of my head because we just announced it, but he's the guy who's the master of kennels, right? He's the Hound Master. He's the Hound Master. Yes, who is better, Pink Floyd or Led Zeppelin?
Zeppelin.
Leonard Skinner.
Wait, you don't like Pink Floyd?
I like Pink Floyd perfectly fine in terms of atmosphere and stuff. It's just like when they start singing, I'm like, you're not good at this. Stop. Or drumming. It's like, where'd the rhythm section go for the last 15 minutes? And Zeppelin, of course, can just go on forever and ever and ever too. But they just had that like tight, rock hard, like Rolling Stones-esque perfect unit of every sound being in its right place and all coming together. So I think maybe Pink Floyd's highest highs are higher than Zeppelin's, like echoes for Pink Floyd, or a lot of the stuff on the wall I love. But for me, most of that stuff hasn't aged super well, and Zeppelin just breaks on through to this just ridiculous, like drunk demigods got together to form a band kind of atmosphere that for me makes it age better. And I know for a lot of people it's exactly the reverse, and there are plenty of good arguments. I think it's just a style preference when it comes to like classic rock and rock of that era. I prefer things with a really, really strong rhythm section, and Pink Floyd for me never quite had that.
But we can agree that Euron would definitely own like 5 copies of Dark Side of the Moon and play them on end.
Euron would be like Dark Side of the Moon's for pansies. I play Bitches Brew by Miles Davis on 1.5 speed.
Wow. All right, we got a question. We got a question from our War of the West and the Kraken's Bane, Lord Micah. Yes, who are your favorite supporting characters for the JON POV chapters?
Wait, how are we defining supporting characters?
I guess anyone who isn't John.
Right. Sam, I guess
he's a POV.
Well, that's the thing. My automatic answer would be Stannis, just because I love the Jon-Stannis relationship. But I don't really think about Stannis as a supporting character in Jon's story because of how much time he spends not in Jon's story. So in terms of characters we pretty much only see from Jon's POV, I might go Mance, just because I think he's a fascinating character politically, and I think he bounces off Jon in some interesting ways. That they have some things in common and some things really not in common at all. And I like their dynamic, and I just love Mance as an isolated character and have a lot to say about when we get to Storm and Dance.
I'm going to go with an interesting choice, and that's going to be Bowen Marsh. I think is probably my favorite supporting character.
No,
not because he's a good guy, because he's definitely not a good guy. But I think like he presents an interesting contrast to Jon, right? Because he represents the conservative side of the Night's Watch, who has always regarded the wildlings as the enemy, right? So consistently,
conservative is a very nice term for that, Jeff. Maybe more revealing than you intended it to be. Carry on.
Okay. Burn. I got owned. But I think it's interesting that like in George in writing this character, he makes his arguments not altogether convincing, but he makes them interesting. He makes interesting arguments against what Jon is doing in A Dance with Dragons. He is consistently working towards undermining Jon Snow, but he does obey Jon's orders until the very end when Jon forswears his vows. And I think that's really fascinating to me that we have this character who fundamentally disagrees with the direction that Jon Snow is taking, but still retains, his service to Jon as Lord Commander until the very end, where Jon does not retain his service to the Night's Watch.
I like Bowen Marsh specifically as a contrast to someone like Alliser Thorne or Janos Slynt, who are just like obviously just unpleasant, like a hammer to your face. Bowen Marsh is more subtle, and I think he represents that Jon is growing up, because Bowen Marsh is the kind of enemies you have to deal with a lot of the time in real politics. Not everyone is like Steve King or Newt Gingrich, where it's just like, I can't stand to even look at you because of how obviously abominable you are. Some people are just a little more subtle in their evil, and phrase it a little more kind of close to institutions. And Bowen Marsh is that kind of guy that you expect him to be a problem for Jon. You do not expect Bowen Marsh to stab Jon the first time through A Dance with Dragons. You expect Alliser Thorne to do that. And it's fine when the show did that, because Alliser Thorne is well set up as an antagonist for Jon. But I like it a lot better in the books when it's this guy who's been sitting in council with him and who can mumble his way through a civil-sounding sentence. But I don't think George is not sparing when he gets at what Bowen Marsh's real problem is. It's nothing logistical or have to do with how we're going to manage these things. It's that he hates the wildlings at this bone-deep level where he does not consider them to be people. And Jon knows that and reacts to that. And I don't think Jon handles it especially well, but he's also so clearly on the right that it's hard to blame him for getting pissed off at Bowen Marsh. But I agree with you, Jeff. I think Bowen's a really interesting part of Jon's dance arc.
You guys are both kicked out of the Sky Palace, and you deserve the flames, because Maester Aemon's right there. What do you?
Oh, who could have seen this coming?
Maester Aemon's right
that there. This would be Matt's choice. I was expecting Alice Karstark, who was also a good one.
I think there's a good top 5 there. I would go Eamon. If I can't have Sam, he would be 2 if he's a POV, if he doesn't count. Egret is a very good one because although I called his A Song of Swords chapters horny, he does romance much better than I would say than horniness and the sadness. And Egret's a pretty great character on her own. And then probably Val and maybe Ed. Ed's a very good one and a very different one. But definitely Eamon. I mean, like, what are you guys even doing? What is this podcast about if you're not saying Eamon as the answer to that question?
It's about
status.
Exactly.
And Mance, right.
And Tormund, of course, is great. He's kind of been memeified by the show, but I love Jon and Tormund's dynamic in the books. Really, Jon has nothing but great supporting characters, I think. Really the opposite of Danny for me in that regard, who I'm just like waiting to meet someone interesting, please.
All right, so we got a question about the podcast itself from Charles, who asks, have you guys decided on how you're going to cover multi-chapter events in the books? I don't think the Red Wedding can be done over a few episodes. It would be too emotionally draining. You know,
George had to write it last, yeah.
Right, and I think I don't know if you guys are like I really liked when we did like Arya 1 to 3 together, and now John 1 and 2 together, and a long time ago now doing Sansa 1 and Eddard 3 together at the same time. But I am curious about feedback from you guys about whether you prefer that style of us doing multiple chapters that are covering multiple events. I think it's going to be hard to do an event like the Blackwater with multiple chapters. I think that's going to take a lot of time for us to kind of unpack all of that. But I can see where like we can put like the Davos and Tyrion chapter together. Well, maybe not, because Davos 3 is such a fantastic fucking chapter in A Clash of Kings. And all of the Tyrion end chapters are really good. And all the Sansa end chapters are really, really good too.
I'm leery about combining multiple different POVs in a single episode. We've only done that once for Sansa 1 and Eddard 3 in A Game of Thrones, which made sense because they were just right after each other in the same place dealing with the same people. But yeah, when you get to the Blackwater, I think maybe, again, we'll definitely get feedback from everybody on this and see what they think. I think it makes sense for me to do like one Blackwater episode on the Davos chapter and then one on the Tyrion chapters and one on the Sansa chapters. That might be, too much. We'll take a look at kind of the page length as we get closer to it. Yeah, the Red Wedding is an interesting case too because there's so many chapters building up to it before you get to the event itself. So we'll see what we do in that regard. But I think Catelyn 7, the main Red Wedding chapter, the one with the drums drumming at the start and ending with the cold blade at her neck. That one I think we got to do alone.
I agree with that. Although I'm curious, like how we're going to do the Arya chapter because it's the shortest chapter in all of A Song of Ice and Fire. I think it's all of 3 pages. But again, I don't read, so I don't know that for a fact. I've just heard people talk about it being 3 pages long. So we'll figure something out when we come there. Let's see here.
What else we got?
There was a question. I'm trying to find it now about where they're asking Matt where the one of the videos that he referenced in the main cast was.
Oh, the Crowfoot's daughter one. Yeah, we did a dual episode at that point where she talked about Baelor the Blessed and I talked about Aerys the Second, kind of like 2 different characters that were probably seeing dragon dreams and like referencing prophecy, but it's not obvious, but they have similarities, which is why we decided to do them at the same time. And she really honed in on and did a lot of research and legwork showing like, yeah, she's absolutely right. All these characters are described the same way. And they all seem to have these same clues, which are revealed with Daron. He's kind of almost like a codex for unlocking the rest of these characters, where it's like, once you see him in person, and you see how he's described in the histories, and they're described the same way. George is using him to unlock the rest of them. And then you can see like, oh yeah, Daenerys the Dreamer wasn't a fluke. She was just the most famous one.
That's a great way, I think, of thinking about these historical characters in general in both Dunk and Egg and the World Book, is that to establish that these are not flukes. That yes, Daenerys is kind of the ultimate crowning example, and maybe her dragon birth was what the other people were dreaming of, but she's part of a pattern more than she is an exception to it, I guess.
Yeah, agreed there.
Oh, and one thing I didn't bring up that I thought I was definitely going to and totally forgot during my monologue is that there was a really interesting thing connecting the Hedge Knight to this chapter in particular, where I said early on where it was like, oh, it seems like this was a late edition. It turns out the Hedge Knight was published only months before Clash of Kings, like very, very close. And this information gets dropped in the first chapter. It's like, yeah, it seems like George probably added this in very late. These were late additions he made to them. And especially when you consider how he even teases the plot of the Hedge Knight in the Clash of Kings, John 1, where he's like, and then Baelor dies in a tourney accident. It's like, a tourney accident? That was a whole damn story, George. A whole great story. And it's like, he's very good at marketing, I'll say, using his works to sell others. And
that's very true.
And I'm sure Game of Thrones was a revelation, but it wasn't super famous like it is now. And I'm sure it didn't hurt that maybe it was in Legends, I think, or something like that. I think that was the name of the anthology. He loves anthologies. I'm sure he didn't miss a point to be like, I wrote this awesome story. It has to do with this. I'm putting it in this chapter you're making me write. It's like, that was probably the compromise for him. I will do this boring building up JON. I will drop this old information, but I am advertising the Hedge Knight.
Exactly. I think my favorite example of how he kind of interweaves the two is Bloodraven showing up in Dance as the three-eyed crow. Because I'm sure that was, it's a beautifully written scene on its own. You will fly, Bran. And I'm sure it was really powerful for people who had no idea who this dude was. But as someone who did, getting to that point, and that his eyes being described as red, and I just had to put the book down and go, oh my God, it's Bloodraven. And just everything starts. That's one of those most amazing moments for me in just reading the series the first time through a given book was that. And it's like, oh, the connections are so interesting. And it was a risk that he did that, because a huge part of what makes that work is knowing who Bloodraven is. And I think that's just, that's kind of the hyperlinked connection you're talking about there is really interesting.
I kind of wonder if it's something about Fire and Blood Volume 1, whether we're going to be reading The Winds of Winter next week or the week after that, and we're going to see parallels or specific things that George put into Fire and Blood Volume 1. We're going to put The Winds of Winter down and be like, oh my God, that's why this fucking story was in Fire and Blood Volume 1. Sure. In the same way that we have Duncan Egg and the story of Bloodraven coming in and really kind of making it much more sustainable, I think, as a novel. I mean, I think if you never read Duncan Egg, you wouldn't be you would still be overwhelmed by who Bloodraven is, or rather who the Three-Eyed Crow is and all the different things about him. But at the same time, I think it makes it much more awesome that the backstory is there for us to enjoy here.
There's a really funny comment here from David Howlett. He said he actually got the Legends anthology. He got it for the Terry Pratchett story, but he goes to say in about the author section for George R. R. Martin, it's still listed A Time for Wolves as an upcoming book.
There's a time capsule.
The original name of A Dream of Spring. Oh, no.
Summer Child.
Oh, that's a dagger. That's a John-sized dagger to the heart.
Let's see here. There was a question about I flashed one up there for a second, but it's not popping up anymore.
Someone delete it?
No, it didn't delete it. Just I can't scroll up higher than from 12 minutes ago, apparently. Here's a question: is there a happy book arc in A Song of Ice and Fire?
Hot Pie.
Yeah,
he gets to leave. He gets to drop out and just be in an inn and be cooking his food, and he gets to stop being on what is for a normal person just an unending nightmare. And maybe he'll come back and something horrible will happen to him. It's entirely possible. But if I was trying to think of a character who actually gets a happy ending, for me, he's the closest one.
Alyssa Farman.
Sure.
But that's not Maine's theory. But she definitely gets a happy ending. She lives her dream. Very few people get that in a Martin story.
Very good point. Jeff, who's happy?
Not Jeff.
Me. I'm
not Jeff.
I'm just getting owned all this podcast. So how happy do you motherfuckers want me to actually be?
Oh,
ecstatic,
buddy.
All right, so we got Lord Micah, Warren of the West and the Crack of Spain, asking, how did you guys react after first reading A Clash of Kings, whether or not you knew the spoilers from the show? So it's interesting. I think my first time reading A Clash of Kings was after season 2, so I knew the major plot beats. I knew the Blackwater was coming up. I knew things like that. What I think I didn't. What my first impression was I was kind of a little bit confused by how prominent Stannis is in Clash versus how he is in season 2. I mean, we get flashes of Stannis. We have some interesting scenes from him, but I was also really curious that they chose to feature Davos as the point of view. I never got that perspective from season 2 that Davos is the point of view there. I would have thought that Stannis would have been the point of view character for A Clash of Kings, but they really make it Stannis centric in the show, and they don't make it in terms of the Stannis scenes, which again, I didn't see him as much of a main character, but then they make Davos the point of view, which I think again frames Stannis in a very different light than what was seen on the show.
That's a great example. I read Clash of Kings before the show ever existed. I'm trying to think what was a kind of big change or difference for me. I definitely Theon as a POV threw me at first because I didn't really see the direction of his plot. Once he gets to Winterfell and the walls start closing in, then it becomes more clear to me. And then I love those chapters a lot. But that definitely was I think Theon's Clash storyline is great on its own, but it just gains so much when you come back after Dance and you know where all this is going. And you see George working in, oh God, Theon's just getting a blowjob and thinking about how awesome his cock is in the first scene. Oh God, I see what he's doing. So I think, I love Clash on the whole. I think it's overall a better book for me, better book than game, but I think it's better on reread when a lot of the stuff it sets up, like with Stannis, has more of a kind of end game and more of a shape to it.
One thing I was surprised about, because I was a dirty show watcher first before I read the books. Dirty. I don't like the way you said that. It doesn't make me feel comfortable.
I liked it just fine.
Of course. Well, yeah, you would. I had mentioned this during the main episode, but I was really surprised at how little it seemed like George was trying to push Jon forward as a main character, because the show makes no bones about the fact that Jon is a main character, that he like the entire story is sort of revolving around him, even at this point. And I just went back and read these, and I was just like, wow, he really was hiding this for quite a long time, where it was just like this weird subplot in the North. You don't know where it's going. Slowly he ramps it up. By the end of the Clash of Kings, you're like, oh, never mind. He is the fantasy protagonist. I didn't realize that, because I thought it was Ned, or I thought it was like Robb or Dany. And it's like very different, especially with the marketing, because I mean, they've since the beginning, they've thrown Kit Harington on everything.
Well, they have the benefit, of course, of having those books behind them and kind of going in with that knowledge, which, that's a whole topic unto itself, is the knowledge of where things are going and how that has both served and not served the show. But yeah, Jon's interesting because you're kind of expecting the whole time in his Clash of Kings arc for the others to show up, which is like also kind of what happens with him in A Dance with Dragons. You're like, that's going to happen, right? And in both cases, George denies that to you, which I think overall works really well in Dance, because it kind of refocuses what Jon's leadership arc is actually about. But yeah, there is that kind of structure you assume is going to be there, and then he kind of adheres to it and kind of doesn't. That's kind of the interesting dynamic with Jon.
Agreed there. We got Lady Erin M, who asks, does the Widow of the Waterfront get a happy ending if Dany burns Old Volantis?
She's not in Old Volantis. I mean, she's not behind the Old Blood Wall.
Yeah,
right? She's on the other side of town. Am I wrong? I could be wrong.
You're right. Because they don't get into beyond the Black Walls, because it can only be the Old Blood and the slaves of the Old Blood who can get in there. So Tyrion and Jorah stay on the outskirts. Although, of course, Tyrion sees the Black Walls, of course, and makes that comment about how it's all sinking into the mud, so to speak. Was that Tyrion? Or was that Quentin? I can't remember which one makes that comment about the Black Walls sinking. I think it'd be interesting. George does this interesting thing in Dance where he kind of has us being like, oh yeah, like you can't wait for like these terrible, awful people to get their comeuppance, right? When in terms of, Cersei Lannister herself, who we're all like, yeah, fuck her, she's awful, she's the worst. And yet when we get her walk of shame, it's like, don't know about that one. That one's that's a little rough there to read that. So you do kind of wonder whether like maybe her perspective will be like, yeah, fuck the slavers up, fuck them up. And then when we actually get like Dany like burning Old Volantis, she'd be like, she might have some regrets about it. Maybe seeing the extent of the destruction that the dragons can produce. I think that might be what's going on there. Maybe, I don't know.
I kind of wonder about that with like the Faceless Men, where they take credit for the doom of Valyria, and I'm sure that was a great moment for them if they actually did it. Like, yes, we took them down, the slave masters are gone, but as they're seeing like the entire civilization sink into the sea, and all the like fair amount of the Valyrians were innocent. Like the Freehold was just like the 40 families that controlled the dragons, and they used that to hold everybody under their thrall. But there are a lot of innocent slaves. There are a lot of innocent commoners probably in Valyria, and as it sank into the sea, I imagine there was some amount of like, it has to be done, I guess. But like, ooh, parts of this don't feel good.
Yeah, agreed there. I think part of me thinks like Volantis is going to be more triumphantly framed than like Pentos or King's Landing. You know what I mean? It's a step earlier on Dany's descent into hell. So I think it is notable that, the slavers are all conveniently behind this little wall, as Tony3483 said in the chat. It's almost like setting Dany up to have a comparatively unambiguous time here compared to Pentos or King's Landing, where you do not have that convenience at all. I think the Widow's going to survive just because I'm thinking of Dany and the Winds of Winter in terms of who her advisors are going to be, and I definitely think she's overall going to favor the more kind of hard-ass, violent ones, and that's the Widow, right? Like, I think she's going to be listening to Tyrion and the Widow of the Waterfront and the Red Priests, and maybe not listening so much to, Missandei or Marwyn the Mage, or people who might be trying to get her onto a better path. At first, I think in Wins, I think she's going to be taking the temptation from those characters.
Agreed there. We got Charles who asked another question, which is favorite passages or monologues from the books. I can't read. Needle was Jon Snow's smile without bursting into tears. Well, I'm going to go with one that we're going to cover here in just a few weeks, actually at the end of this month, which is, of course, the Proudwing story, which Stannis monologues the entire time, which is great. It's so awesome. Cannot wait to get to that. We will have a very, very, very special guest for that episode itself. Very being the key word here, and special being the other keyword. And it's going to be a lot of fun to do that one for sure. I think that's probably one of my favorites. What do you guys think?
I mean, the Proudwing one is great just because it both sets up Stannis as like, sympathetic, like, he had this heart and he cared. And then, but there's the implied ending to that story where he either directly killed Proudwing or just abandoned it. So that's the great duality is very well presented there. I really love Big Bucket Wool's speech in A Dance.
That's a good one.
In the King's Prize when he says, yeah, we're probably going to die. And the Southern Lords are like, what? And you're fine with that? And he says, it doesn't matter if I'm fine with it. Like, what I would be fine with is being young again and living forever and having whatever I want. I can't have that. It doesn't matter. This is what we're here to do. And I think it's one of the few times in the story that, it's not one of the few times, it's one of the times in the story where George is trying to get across to you that there's motivation for going to war that is understandable, even as he completes the focus on just the utter horror in doing so, as we were talking about with Dany going after the slavers. That Big Bucket is saying he wants to bathe in Bolton blood, not because he's a sadist, but because what other death are my men going to have? Sitting in the snow and crying and feeling the tears freeze to their cheeks, and that there's just nothing there. And so this is a way we can go out that has meaning. And I think that's partially a ridiculous power fantasy that gets people killed. But I think it also reflects a genuine reality of Northern warrior culture, and there's something heroic in terms of like, we're going to go out specifically so the younger generation has enough food, as Alice Karstark describes. This is what old men do in the North. They go out and die so that the rest of the people can eat. And I love that monologue for that.
I wonder if Mormont was thinking that. Maybe that was his motivation.
I'm sure.
Yeah.
At a subconscious level, I think there was I think there was kind of a death wish going on with Jeor. I don't know how aware of it he was, but I feel like that's kind of what's going on.
Sure. I think everyone's expecting me to say love is the death of duty. That is actually not my favorite passage from the books. It's high up there. Mine is from, it's a really kind of a long one, but it's from Aemon's dying scenes in Samwell 3 and 4. There's one particular line that really gets me, but the whole thing's amazing. The line that gets me is where he says, "Well, I talk with Egg again, find Daron whole and happy, hear my sisters singing to their children," when he's talking about if he's going to the afterlife, if he'll see them. And it's such a humanizing moment for Aemon, because when we see him, he's giving people advice about where their life should go, and he's talking about like, oh, Stannis' sword is bullshit, or he's like trying to like give advice on where the watch should go and how people should survive. And this is a very personal moment for him. And you see like him going back to even where he was a kid and like, Egg, I dreamed I was old and all these things. It's like, he's not just old man Aemon, he's the Aemon he's been all of his life. And he really just wanted to be happy, and how his pursuits, unfortunately, he feels that he destroyed his family. And how that resonates throughout the rest of the story, how many other characters probably should feel that way, but don't. Like Euron should feel that way, but he'll never say that line. And I think it makes Aemon such a lovely character, and it's a beautiful sentiment from George, just the entire passage. But that one in particular is such a human moment, and like a gut punch, and more like a punch right in the heart that you don't really expect from epic high fantasy.
So much of A Feast for Crows specifically is about not just death, but about how death, like it doesn't, like Dolores says, it doesn't even teach you anything. You don't even get anything out of it. You don't even learn these lessons. And what I really love about that Aemon monologue is how it ends with this fear that what death is really like is the whites. That's what death is. This emptiness. And if you come back at all, if you have any kind of being after death, it's a lifeless shell being puppeted by the others. And I think that's what Aemon really fears in that moment, is they're not going to be there for me. And they've been gone long, long ago and exist only in my mind. And when my mind goes, they go with it. So much about Feast kind of deals with that idea from a bunch of different angles on the variety, dealing with a bunch of different dead people. So Yeah, but I think, Feast is kind of a bitter, nihilistic book for a lot of it, even more so than the rest of the series. And Aemon really kind of feels like the heart of that book in a lot of ways for me, because he's the one dealing with death in a very, as you say, very relatable, sympathetic way, and not like in the let's elect a Euron king kind of way.
He's even like, I would say, the heart of House Targaryen, where as we learn about them, they generally seem like pretty terrible people most of the time, or they seem really unapproachable, almost like gods.
Right. Even the good ones like Baelor Breakspear seems like a little too good. Like he's not quite a person.
And then you get Aemon, and it's like, no, they do have a heart. They're not just dragon lords. They started somewhere, but they went somewhere terrible, unfortunately. Danny, sorry.
Exactly, and it's connected to their mortality. Like Aemon is the one who recognizes mortality, which is the thing the Targaryens kind of seem to fear the most, and that's what allows him to be humanized.
All right, I think 2 more questions. Is that cool with you guys? I think. We got one from Rob who asked, do you think the differences in Sansa's show versus book arc, no Jane Poole, will change her role in the North at the end?
At the end? I don't think so. The route is going to be a lot different. I think she's going north with the Vale Knights instead of on her own, and then they come later. But the endgame as queen, I've always kind of suspected that was Sansa's endgame in the books, and I think that's still going to be the case, yeah.
Yeah, I think that's probably where she's going. I do wonder about Harry the heir, because he seems like such a D-bag, and she looks up to him so much, and especially with the situation she's in. Like, I don't think we're going to get the Jane Poole plot, but I think there's a chance that George is going to put some real dickheads treating her very badly. Maybe probably not Jane Poole bad, probably nowhere near that, but on her way to being queen in the North, because that whole tourney seems set up in a very uncomfortable way, the way like everyone's swirling around her like sharks.
Very true. I mean, for me, Harry just seems like such a chump to me.
Yeah,
hard time believing he's going to be super. Because he reminds me of Waymar Royce, really more than anybody, as this kind of proud but poor son of the Vale who thinks he's a bigger deal than he is. I feel like Shadrick, the Mad Mouse, might be a danger. I don't think he's going to last particularly long. But I think if there's going to be like a real wrench thrown in Sansa's storyline, I think it might come from him.
Or Lynn Corbray is a good one too.
Lynn Corbray, the Dark Star from the Vale. White Dark Star. White Star. That's Lynn Corbray.
All right. Final question from Eric R. I know you had a question earlier about the Arthurian legend and the Song of Ice and Fire, so I didn't get to that one to get clicked out before I can get that. He asks, what object do you want to see on the cover of A Dream of Spring?
Is it Proudwing, Jeff? Do you want to see Proudwing?
I want to see Stannis like sitting the Iron Throne. That's going to be the image that I want to see for the cover for A Dream of Spring.
I guess the most appropriate one would be like a melted Iron Throne, but that kind of gives it away. But it's already kind of given away,
right?
I really, there was that not real cover of Winds with the Horn on it that I still very much want to be real. I must admit,
because you love that horn stuff.
Because I love the magic horns. I love magical doodads and magical MacGuffins of all shapes and sizes. Which, maybe Dream of Spring. Maybe it's could just be a sword. Could be Dawn. If Dawn comes into play, that would make sense. Yeah.
I think George did this stupid cameo in this like zombie show on Sci-Fi. I want to say a couple years ago, and he was signing books for Dream of Spring, and the cover was of a rose. I think that would be really interesting to have that.
Oh, the blue rose?
Yep. I think it's a blue. I think actually it might even be like a yellow rose. I don't even know.
Sure.
But a blue rose would make more sense, I think, than a yellow rose for sure, given the Lyanna backstory.
That would be great.
Blue rose growing from the cheek of a wall, filling the world with sweetness. I think that would be a good.
And if Daenerys is focused on A Dream of Spring, which I think it will be, it seems unlikely they're going to be near each other in Winds of Winter. Dany sees the image of Jon as the blue rose in House of the Undying, so yeah, that works pretty well.
Absolutely.
I have kind of I don't think this would work, but it also kind of depends on which version of it you're talking about, because sometimes he does like the mass market, like really like tableau versions, and sometimes they do the single object. So if we're talking about the single object, I think it would be interesting if he did like a callback to the stag and the wolf from how they were locked together, and if he did that with like a wolf and a dragon or something like that.
That would be great. You could do a stylized version because you have the shield-ish thing on the cover of Dance. You could do like a kind of more stylized version of that involving a wolf. I can picture that for sure.
And like a tree behind it, or maybe like Dunk's sigil. That'd be a good one.
That would be great. I would love that.
A take on that, not the exact one, not the one exactly from the Hedge Knight, but like something that's meant to be more representative of the rest of the story.
Agreed
Yeah.
there. That'd be a lot of fun. So I think if you guys are good, I think we're going to close it out here. So it's about 11:30 on Freedom Standard Time. So I think
Oof.
we're going to close out for the evening. Thank you guys so much for joining us. It was a lot of fun to chat with you guys, and we're slowly learning how to do this live stream thing. I appreciate you guys sticking around with us for so long. It's fun doing these things monthly, so we appreciate that, and we really appreciate Matt, who's a veteran of these live streams, coming on here and
Hell yeah.
talking his Targaryen nonsense, which is fantastic and awesome as always.
I do love my Targaryen nonsense. Yeah, streams are fun. The key, if anybody's thinking about streaming, is you pretend the audience doesn't exist. You don't look at the numbers. You don't look at the chat flying by. You just focus on the other people. It makes it a lot easier, especially when like you get big numbers. Like I think I saw you guys. We got something like 100 or something tonight.
Oh, did we?
Not bad at
Sweet.
all. At one point, yeah. Yeah, you got to pretend the audience isn't there, pretend the other people aren't there. Just talk
Yeah,
and listen.
just talk on your own. But yeah, it's I actually think like going to cons and like speaking on those stages, even when the numbers are far less. Like I think during the season, I think I got like 900 people going at one stream.
That's awesome.
But like there were way less people in like certain Con of Thrones panels I was on, but that was way more nerve wracking because the people are real, and I think that's important.
They're looking at you with their human faces and such. Yeah.
Yeah, they're not just chatting at you. They're not numbers on a YouTube screen.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, agreed. Amen, brothers. That was pretty good. Everyone has to take one last drink now. So thank you guys for joining us. Really appreciate it. It's been a lot of fun. We will see you guys next week with Stephen Atwell with the Clash of Kings Catelyn 1. And we will see you guys next month for a soon to be announced next stream, whatever that's going to be. We haven't decided yet, actually. We will decide, of course, at some point down the road. Take care.
Bye-bye.